Hey, my friend, settle in. Get comfortable. If these stories have quietly become part of your evening, some small habit you never exactly plan on but somehow kept anyway, subscribing would mean more than you probably realize. And if tonight is one of those nights where you just need something gentle to carry you under, a like genuinely helps. I would genuinely love to know where you are listening from tonight. So tell me in the comments below. Maybe you are somewhere in Ohio with the air conditioning humming low. Maybe you're in a quiet flat in Manchester with the window cracked to the summer air. I read every single one of those comments truly, usually far too late at night myself. Now, pull that blanket up over your shoulder, even if it is warm out. There's something about the weight of it that helps. Let your hands rest. Let your breathing slow, one long exhale at a time. All right, let's go. Tonight's story takes us inside the private world of Elizabeth I's own dinner table, through kitchens and corridors that most of her own court was never once allowed to see. We are stepping into the working heart of an English royal palace a little past 4 in the morning in the summer of 1590, and the ovens have already been burning for 2 hours. Not because anyone in the palace has actually asked for bread yet. Not this early. 'Cause bread cannot be rushed, not properly. And in a kitchen built to feed a queen, nothing that truly matters is ever rushed. A man with flour to his elbows is folding dough that will become one of perhaps a dozen different kinds of bread served before the sun is properly up, and behind him, in a second room entirely, someone else is already elbowed deep in pastry that will not be eaten by anyone for another 8 hours. Here's the first thing that tends to surprise people about what it took to feed Elizabeth Tudor on an ordinary day. Not a banquet day, not a visiting ambassador day, just an ordinary Tuesday in her own rooms with no one watching. The kitchens working that morning were not preparing one meal. They were preparing dozens of dishes, sometimes more than we can comfortably count. And the queen herself might taste 4 or 5 of them briefly before turning her attention elsewhere. The rest went to her household, to her ladies, to the officers who ran her court. Some of it, frankly, went nowhere at all and was quietly disposed of by servants who had learned not to ask questions about waste, in a household where waste was, in its own strange way, a form of power. That is the shape of this story. Abundance built around a woman who, by most accounts that have survived her, actually ate rather modestly. And somewhere in the gap between what was prepared and what was consumed lived an entire world of servants, cooks, tasters, and quiet observers who saw a version of the queen that almost no one else in England ever got to see. I find that gap genuinely fascinating. Stay with me tonight, and I will walk you through it kitchen by kitchen, tray by tray, all the way to the small private table where Elizabeth actually sat down to eat. Let's start with the ovens. A queen's bread was not one bread. There was a fine white maunch made from the most carefully bolted flour available, soft and pale, reserved for Elizabeth's own table and for the highest members of her household. There was a coarser, browner loaf for servants further down the hierarchy, made from flour that had not been sifted nearly so many times. The difference between the 2 loaves, sitting side by side on a cooling rack, told you almost everything you needed to know about where a person stood in that world long before they opened their mouth to speak. The man shaping the manure dough this particular morning has done this thousands of times. His hands know the weight of a proper loaf without a scale, the give of dough that is proofed exactly long enough, the slight tackiness that means it needs another few minutes and not a second more. He works near a fire that has been fed since well before dawn, and the room around him smells with smoke, warm flour, and the faint sourness of yeast that has been kept alive generation after generation in a covered crock near the hearth. Somewhere behind him, through an archway into a second chamber, a woman is straining honey through cloth into a wide ceramic bowl, and the sound is almost nothing, just a slow, thick drip, drip, drip that only she can really hear over the general noise of the kitchen. I want to pause here and tell you something that surprises a lot of people. Sugar in Elizabeth's England was not the everyday sweetener we think of now. It was extraordinarily expensive, imported from Mediterranean and later Atlantic sources, refined into hard cones that had to be broken apart with a special hammer before use, and it functioned almost as a kind of edible currency of status. A household that used a great deal of sugar was announcing something about itself, and Elizabeth, by every account that survives from those who served her, loved sugar. Sweetmeats, candied fruits, sugar wafers. Marchpane worked into elaborate shapes. Her fondness for it was well known inside her own household, whispered about a little further out, and would eventually, later in her reign, become something visitors quietly noted when they had the chance to observe her up close. We will come back to that later. It connects to something I think you'll find genuinely touching about a woman who ruled the most powerful country in the world, and still in her own private moments reached for something sweet the way any of us might. For now, back to the kitchen, because there's a great deal more happening before the sun is even fully up. In a room adjacent to the bread ovens, a boy no older than perhaps 14 is turning a spit over a bed of coals, and on it, slowly rendering into something rich and dark at the edges, is a joint of beef that will not be served for hours yet. Roasting meat properly for a royal table takes time, patience, and someone willing to stand near a fire in the middle of summer in a kitchen that is already unbearably warm, turning a heavy iron handle again and again and again. He's not thinking about Elizabeth. Not really. He's thinking about his arm, which aches, and about breakfast, which he has not had yet, and about whether the head cook will notice if he lets the fire die down just slightly to make the work easier. He will not risk it. The head cook notices everything, and this, I think, is worth sitting with for a moment. We tend to imagine royal kitchens as grand ceremonial spaces, full of purpose and reverence. Mostly they were just kitchens, hot, loud, exhausting places full of tired people doing repetitive work, the same as any kitchen anywhere, except that the stakes, if something went wrong, were considerably higher than in an ordinary house. There is a smaller room tucked just off the main kitchen that most of the staff refer to simply as the spicery, and it is here that some of the most expensive ingredients in the entire palace are kept under lock. Cinnamon bark, whole nutmeg still in its lacy covering of mace, cloves from islands most of the kitchen staff could not have pointed to on a map, black pepper measured out grain by grain, because it is worth ounce for ounce something close to silver. A clerk keeps a careful written record of what leaves this room and what is not, because spices of this kind do not simply run out and get reordered the way flour does. They arrive on ships after months at sea, after passing to the hands of merchants in half a dozen ports, and every grain of pepper that goes missing is, in a very real sense, money walking out the door. The woman who holds the key to the spicery this particular summer has worked in the royal household for nearly 20 years, and she still, if she's honest with herself, feels a small thrill each time she unlocks that door. Not because she intends to steal anything, because the smell that greets her, warm and dark and faintly sharp, is unlike anything most people in England will ever encounter in their lives. Sugar and spice together, in the quantities kept in this one small room, represented more wealth than most of Elizabeth's subjects would see in a lifetime of ordinary work. She measures out cinnamon and a careful portion of sugar for a dish of stewed pears that will be served, if all goes well, at the Queen's own table later that evening. Stewed fruit, gently spiced, was a genuine favorite of Elizabeth's, according to those close enough to notice such things. And it says something rather lovely, I think, that a woman who commanded armies and outmaneuvered kings on the diplomatic stage still had a particular fondness for something as simple and comforting as fruit cooked soft with a little sugar and spice. Let's leave the spicery for a moment and walk further down the corridor, past the ovens, past the roasting fires, to a doorway that most people in the palace are simply not permitted through. This is where the tasting happens. Poison was not an abstract fear in Elizabeth's world. It was a documented historically real anxiety that shaped the entire architecture of how royal food moved through a palace. Monarchs across Europe had genuine reason to worry about it, and English royal households by this point had developed an entire quiet system of precautions built specifically around this fear. Certain trusted servants, often called tasters or essayers, depending on the period in the household, were responsible for sampling dishes before they reached anyone of importance. And this was not a ceremonial gesture performed for show. It was taken with real seriousness by the people whose job it was. A man standing near that restricted doorway this morning has held this particular role for several years now. He does not think of himself as brave, particularly, though there is something quietly remarkable about a job that consists in part of putting your own body between a monarch and the possibility of harm. He tastes a spoonful from a dish of pottage before it is allowed to continue on toward the Queen's private rooms, waits, nods once, and steps back to let it pass. It is such a small gesture, a spoonful, a pause, a nod, and it happens dozens of times a day, quietly, almost invisibly, threaded through every single meal that makes its way to Elizabeth's table. I find something strangely moving in that, an entire hidden structure of trust and risk built around the simple act of a woman sitting down to eat her dinner. Beyond the tasting room, a narrow stone stairway leads down toward the cellars, and the air changes almost immediately, growing cooler, damper, carrying a mineral smell of stone that has never quite dried out. This is where the wine lives. Casks from France, from Spain, from the Rhineland, stacked in careful rows, each one marked and recorded by a seller who treats his ledger with something close to reverence. Elizabeth, by most accounts, drank in genuinely modest quantities for a woman of her rank and era, favoring a light wine cut generously with water, though the household around her consumed considerably more, and ale brewed on site in vast quantities remained the ordinary daily drink for most of the palace staff, consumed at every meal by nearly everyone, the way we might reach for water today. Further along, in a room kept even cooler than the wine cellar, sit ceramic jars of preserved fruit, cherries and damsons and plums put up in sugar syrup months earlier, waiting for a moment when fresh fruit was out of season and something sweet was still required. Preservation in this world was not a convenience. It was a genuine skill practice carefully because a household that ran out of preserved fruit in the depths of winter had very few good alternatives. A young woman moves between the wine casks and the fruit jars with a small lamp, checking seals, noting anything that looks amiss, and she pauses for a moment, near a jar of candied orange peel that arrived only recently, imported at considerable expense, and simply looks at it. Orange trees did not grow in England. Every piece of that candied peel had traveled a very long way to end up in a cool stone room beneath the palace, waiting for a night when someone decided the Queen might enjoy something bright and citrus and sweet after a long day of audiences and correspondence. Upstairs again, and the palace has begun to change shape around the food as it moves. What started as a chaotic sweating, Violet Kitchen slowly gives way to something more formal, more hushed, as dishes are transferred from working trays onto silver plate, covered with domed lids to keep them warm and to keep them, just as importantly, hidden from casual eyes. A covered dish is a small kind of secret, carried by a servant walking a very particular route through the palace. A route that has been walked so many times it has worn its own faint path into the stone floor. Guards stand at certain doorways along this route. Not many, not an army. Just enough trusted men positioned at the right thresholds to make certain that only servants known to the household, servants whose faces and names are recognized, are permitted to carry food any close to the Queen's private rooms. This was not paranoia so much as ordinary good sense in a world where the person walking through your door with dinner really could in theory be an instrument of someone else's ambition. And so the dish of stewed pears, the Menet bread, the small portion of roasted meat cut thin, the wine cut with water, all of it moves together now, tray after tray, carried by servants whose footsteps have gone quiet and careful up a final flight of stairs, through a final guarded door into a set of rooms considerably smaller and considerably calmer than anything we've seen so far tonight. This is where Elizabeth actually eats, not in some cavernous hall with musicians and courtiers watching her every bite, though those grand public meals still happen often enough, and we will spend real time on them later tonight. This is her private dining. The meals she took mostly among a small circle of trusted ladies and attendants, away from performance of monarchy, in rooms warmed by a modest fire, even in summer evenings, lit by beeswax candles that burn cleaner and brighter than the tallow used further down the household. A table has already been laid. linen so fine and so carefully bleached that it seems almost to glow in the candlelight. A single knife, because forks were not yet in common use in England at this point in history, and most food was managed with fingers, a knife, and a great deal of practiced grace. A silver cup standing ready for wine, and near the head of the table, a chair that looks to modernize, almost unremarkable, except that everyone in the room understands with total clarity who alone is permitted to sit in it. Maybe she is a lady who has served in this role for years now, someone who knows exactly how Elizabeth prefers her wine poured, exactly how close the bread should sit to her hand, exactly which of tonight's dishes the Queen is likely to reach for first, and which she will barely touch. Maybe she is newer to the role, still learning these small, unspoken rules, watching the more experienced women around her for cues she has not yet memorized. Either way, she stands quietly near the table now, waiting because Elizabeth has not yet entered the room, and nothing on this table will be touched until she does. Here is the paradox I want you to sit with for a moment, because it threads through everything we are going to explore tonight. This table laid with such extraordinary care, surrounded by servants who have spent the entire day making certain everything is exactly right, exists for a woman who, according to nearly every account left behind by people who actually watched her eat, consumed remarkably little of what was placed in front of her. Vast effort, vast expense, vast quantities of food, converging on one small woman who might eat a portion of bread, a little stewed fruit, a few bites of meat, and leave the rest largely untouched. Nobody quite knew, watching from the edges of the room, whether this came from genuine restraint, from the demands of a body that carried the weight of governing a kingdom, from simple personal taste, or from something else entirely that Elizabeth herself never explained to anyone, the servants who cleared her table each night. However, learn to read those uneaten dishes the way you might read a letter. What was gone told you she had been hungry. What remained told you something, too, if you knew how to look. The door opens finally, and Elizabeth enters without ceremony, at least not the kind visitors from foreign courts would have recognized. Here, among women she trusts, she moves more simply. She has already been dressed for the evening, of course, her gown settled and her jewels in place, because a queen did not undress for dinner the way we might slip into something comfortable at the end of a long day. But something in her posture loosens slightly the moment the door closes behind her, the way any of ours might after a day spent being watched by people who wanted something from us. She sits. The lady standing nearest pours wine cut with water in the proportion Elizabeth prefers, and sets the cup within easy reach without being asked. This is a choreography of long familiarity, the kind that develops between a person and those who have spent years anticipating her needs before she has to voice them. Elizabeth reaches first tonight for the bread, breaks a small piece of Manet loaf, the pale, fine-textured version reserved for her table alone, and eats it slowly while glancing at the other dishes without any particular urgency. There is no rush in this room. Whatever crisis or negotiation had occupied her hours earlier has been left for the moment outside the door. I want to spend a little time here on what an ordinary private meal might actually have contained, because I think the specifics matter more than any general description could. Meat always present, prepared in relatively simple ways for private dining, compared with the elaborate presentations reserved for banquets. Perhaps a portion of mutton or veal roasted plainly, or a small dish of fowl. Fish appeared regularly, too, particularly on the many days across the year when religious custom required abstaining from meat. And we will spend real time on those fasting days shortly, because they shape the rhythm of the entire kitchen in ways that might surprise you. Vegetables, when they appeared at all on a table this rank, tended to be treated almost as an afterthought, a small side dish rather than the centerpiece, since vegetables carried associations in this period with the diets of the poor. And a wealthy table signaled itself instead through meat, through sugar, through spice, through abundance, rather than through what we would now think of as balance. Sweets came at the end, or sometimes scattered throughout, since Elizabeth in dining did not follow the strict core structure that would develop in later centuries. Tonight it is the stewed pears from the spicery, softened in sugar and a little cinnamon, and Elizabeth reaches for these with what her lady, watching quietly, recognizes as genuine pleasure, not performance, not the practiced graciousness she might show at a public feast, accepting a dish because refusing it would offend the person who offered it, something closer to simple appetite, the kind any of us might feel reaching for a favorite comfort at the end of a difficult day. Maybe her lady is someone who has learned over years of quiet observation that this is when Elizabeth is most herself, not the queen depicted on coins and informal portraits, upright and untouchable, but a woman in her 50s by this point in her reign, tired in a particular way that comes from carrying enormous responsibility, finding a small measure of comfort in stewed fruit and warm bread, and the company of people she does not have to perform for. We should talk about her teeth briefly because it comes up so often when people discuss Elizabeth's diet, and I want to handle it gently and honestly rather than sensationally. Several visitors and observers over the course of her later reign did note in passing that her teeth had darkened and that some had been lost, and many historians reasonably connect this, at least in part, to a genuine lifelong fondness for sugar in a period before anyone understood dental hygiene the way we do now. It is a small human detail, and I think it deserves to be treated as exactly that. Not a scandal, not a joke, just a quiet piece of evidence that even a queen was underneath the crown, and the portrait's a person whose body responded to the choices available to her the same way any of ours would. Let's step back from the table for a moment and talk about time, because the calendar shaped what appeared on Elizabeth's plate almost as much as her own personal taste did. England under Elizabeth remained, at least officially, banned by a rhythm of fasting days, inherited from centuries of religious practice, even as the country's religious identity itself had shifted considerably during her reign and her father's before her. Fridays, Saturdays, the whole extended season Lent leading up to Easter, and a scattering of other observed days throughout the year, all required abstaining from meat. And on these days, the royal kitchens simply reorganized themselves around fish instead. This was not a small adjustment. A kitchen that spent most of its energy roasting beef and mutton and preparing elaborate meat pies had to pivot on fasting days toward an entirely different set of skills and ingredients. Fresh fish wanted to be had, carried in from coastal suppliers or from rivers and ponds kept specifically for this purpose. Salted and preserved fish when fresh was not available. Soaked and prepared to draw out some of the harsh saltiness before cooking. Eels, which were genuinely common and well regarded at this point in English history in a way that might surprise a modern listener. Oysters, plentiful and comparatively inexpensive along much of the English coast, appearing on tables far more often than they would centuries later once over-harvesting made them a luxury. A cook working the fish course on a Friday in this kitchen has an entirely different set of problems than her colleague working meat the rest of the week. And there is a particular kind of quiet pride in her work, because fish prepared badly announces itself immediately in a way that a well-seasoned roast can sometimes forgive. She works with a light hand, a little butter, a little of the same imported spice that flavors so much else in this kitchen, and produces a dish that on the Queen's table that evening will sit alongside bread and stewed fruit in place of the meat that would ordinarily anchor the meal. There is something worth noticing in how seriously this rhythm was maintained, even at the highest level of the household. Even for a queen whose own religious position had been across her lifetime complicated and occasionally dangerous to hold. Fasting days were not merely private religious observance. They were a public signal, visible in what left the kitchen, and what did not, that the crown continued to honor a structure of religious life that stretched back long before Elizabeth or her father had ever worn it. And then there were the feast days scattered to the calendar, like small bright counterweights to all that restraint. Christmas, Easter, once Lent had finally ended. Certain saints' days still observed with particular foods attached to them by tradition too old and too beloved to fully abandon. On these days the kitchen's ordinary abundance multiplied even further, and dishes appeared that simply did not exist on an ordinary Tuesday. Elaborate pies shaped and decorated for the occasion, roasted meats in far greater variety, sweets and spice wine, and all the visual theater that a great feast required. Maybe you are already noticing a pattern here, because I think it is one of the more human threads running through this entire story. Elizabeth's calendar, like anyone's, moved between restraint and abundance, between plainer days and richer ones, between the quiet private meal we just watch or eat and the grand public spectacle we are about to walk through together. The rhythm feels in its own way oddly familiar. We all live inside some version of that same pattern, even now, even without a crown. Now, let us slow down here for a moment and talk about the other kind of meal entirely. The kind Elizabeth ate, not among a handful of trusted ladies, but in front of the entire watching world. Public dining in Elizabeth's court was never really about eating at all. It was theater, carefully staged, and everyone involved understood performance, even if they rarely said so out loud. Picture a great hall, considerably larger than the intimate rooms we've been sitting in tonight, hung with tapestries that had taken skilled weavers years to complete, lit by more candles than most English households would burn in a month. Long tables run the length of the room, filled with courtiers, ambassadors, favored guests, all dressed in fabrics chosen specifically to be seen. At the far end, on a raised platform beneath the canopy estate, sits Elizabeth's own table, positioned so that everyone in the room can watch her without appearing to stare. And they do watch. That is rather the point. The food arriving at a banquet like this bears almost no resemblance to the modest, comfortable dishes we saw earlier tonight in her private rooms. Here, presentation mattered as much as flavor, sometimes more. Elaborate pies constructed to resemble castles or ships. Sugar sculptures worked by hand into fantastic shapes. Animals and heraldic symbols and miniature landscapes entirely edible and entirely intended to be admired before they were, if they were, eventually eaten. Whole roasted birds were dressed in their own feathers after cooking, arranged to look startlingly alive on the platter. This was food as spectacle, food as a demonstration of wealth and taste, and the sheer organizational power required to produce something this elaborate on a single evening. A servant carrying one of these sculpted sugar centerpieces through the hall walks with particular care, aware that a single misstep could destroy hours of confectioner's work in an instant, and aware, too, that every eye in the room is following the dish's progress toward the high table. There is a kind of pressure in that walk that has nothing to do with the weight of what he carries. Elizabeth, seated beneath her canopy, ate very little at these grand public meals by most surviving accounts. And this is worth sitting with because it tells us something rather sharp about the gap between the meal as spectacle and the meal as sustenance. She was watched constantly. Every gesture, every dish she accepted or declined, every moment of visible enjoyment or visible restraint will be noted, discussed, carried outward by ambassadors into letters sent to foreign courts describing the English queen's health, her mood, her apparent favor toward this dish or that guest. Eating in public for Elizabeth was never simply eating. It was diplomacy conducted one small bite at a time. I think that is part why her private meals mattered so much, even if history remembers the banquets far more vividly. In her own rooms, among a small circle of women she trusted, she could finally just eat, reach for the bread because she wanted the bread, finish the stewed pears because she genuinely liked them, not because leaving them untouched might be read as an insult to whoever had them prepared. The contrast between these two versions of dining, the performed and the private, runs through her entire reign like a kind of hidden seam, visible only to the servants who moved between both worlds and understood better than almost anyone else in England which version was closer to the truth. Let's follow one of those servants now, because I think her perspective might be the most interesting one in this entire story. Maybe she is a woman who began her service in the royal household as a girl barely into her teens, learning first the simplest tasks, carrying, fetching, standing quietly against a wall for hours at a time until her legs ached and her presence became so familiar that the room around her stopped noticing she was there at all. That particular kind of invisibility earned over years is its own strange privilege. It meant she saw things. She saw Elizabeth laugh once at something a lady said quietly near the fire. A real laugh, unguarded, nothing like the practiced smile shown to foreign envoys. She saw the queen push a dish of overly rich meat aside without comment on an evening when her stomach was clearly troubling her, and saw the kitchen quietly adjust the following day's offerings without anyone above stairs, ever issuing a formal instruction to do so. She saw more than once Elizabeth eat almost nothing at all during a public feast, and then hours later, in the privacy of her own rooms, finally eat properly, hungrily, the way anyone might after holding themselves carefully together in front of an audience all evening. None of this made its way into official records. There was no reason for it to, but it lived quietly in the memory of the women who served her closest, passed along sometimes in the smallest of comments to a newer servant, learning the household's unspoken rules. This is what she prefers when she is tired. This is what she cannot abide when her stomach is unsettled. This is the dish to bring when nothing else has tempted her all day. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a great hall after a banquet is ended and the guests have finally drifted away toward their own beds. And it is a quiet almost nobody outside the household ever witnesses. Long tables that only an hour earlier groaned under sculpted sugar and roasted birds and towers of pastry now sit half cleared. Candles burned down to stubs, wine stains soaking slowly into linen that servants have not yet had time to gather. And here is something that genuinely surprises people when they hear it for the first time. A staggering amount of food from an occasion like this simply went uneaten, not a plate here or there. Entire dishes barely touched. Elaborate constructions that had taken a confectioner the better part of the day to build, now sitting cold and abandoned because presentation, not consumption, had been the point all along. What happened to it depended a great deal on what it was. Some food, still perfectly good, made its way down to the household hierarchy, feeding the lower servants, who spent the entire evening on their feet, carrying trays to other people's tables. Almoners in wealthy households of this era were traditionally responsible for distributing surplus food to the poor gathered at the gates, a practice with genuinely old roots in English custom, though how consistently this happened at the royal level by Elizabeth's reign is something historians reconstruct carefully rather than state with total certainty. Other dishes, the ones already picked over, already cooling into something considerably less appetizing than they had been an hour earlier, were simply discarded, and a small crew of servants moved through the emptying hall in the deep hours of the night, clearing plate, gathering linen, sweeping away the debris of the spectacle that had already served its purpose the moment the last guest turned to admire it. Maybe she is one of those servants, moving to the hall with a basket at her hip, gathering half-eaten sweetmeats into it without much sentiment, because she has done this often enough that the strangeness of it, well thrown carelessly aside, has long since worn off. She works quickly, quietly, aware that the sooner this hall is cleared, the sooner she can find her own bed, and aware, too, in some part of her mind she rarely examines closely that the food she is discarding tonight would have fed her entire family for a week back in the village she came from. There is no bitterness in this observation. Particularly, it is simply the shape of the world she lives in, understood the way you understand weather, something to work around rather than something to rage against. Let's go back further still, past the kitchens, past even the palace walls, to where all of this actually began. Feeding a royal household on this scale required a supply chain that reached out across a considerable stretch of English countryside, and much of it began at first light in markets and orchards and gardens tended specifically for this purpose. Certain estates near the palace maintained kitchen gardens whose entire output was designated for the royal table, tended by gardeners who understood exactly which vegetables and herbs the head cook expected delivered on which mornings. Orchards supplied apples and pears, and when the season allowed, the more delicate stone fruits that needed to travel quickly before they spoiled. Fishmongers would contract to supply the royal household rose before dawn to secure the freshest catch. Aware that fish delivered even a few hours late might be rejected outright by a kitchen with no patience for anything less than excellent, a cart rattling toward the palace gates in the gray light of early morning might carry baskets of early peas, bundles of herbs still damp with dew, a crate of live poultry destined to be dispatched and dressed within the hour. The driver knows this route well, has driven it more mornings than he could easily count, and barely glances at the palace walls rising ahead of him anymore, though there was a time years back when the sight of them still gave him a small thrill of pride, delivering food that would end up, however indirectly, on the Queen's own table. I think there is something worth noticing in just how many hands touched a single meal before it ever reached Elizabeth. The gardener who grew the peas, the driver who carried them, the kitchen boy who shelled them, the cook who prepared them, the taster who sampled them, the lady who served them, an entire quiet chain of ordinary people, most of whom Elizabeth never met and never would, all working in concert to produce a single evening's dinner that she might in the end barely touch. Let's move forward now into the particular rhythm of an ordinary day, because the meals themselves followed a structure that shaped the entire palace's schedule around them. Breakfast in Elizabeth's household was a considerably lighter affair than the meals we have spent most of the night exploring. And this itself tells us something about how Tudor England understood the day's first meal compared with how we might think of breakfast now. For most of the household, breakfast meant bread, perhaps some cold meat left from the previous day, and ale consumed relatively quickly before the working day properly began. For Elizabeth herself, breakfast tended to be modest, sometimes barely more than bread and a small portion of meat or fish, taken quietly, often while she was already occupied with correspondence, or with the first audiences of the morning. A lady bringing in the small breakfast tray in the gray early hours of the morning has learned that Elizabeth rarely lingers over it. The Queen's mind by this hour is usually already elsewhere on letters that need answering on a council meeting scheduled for later on some diplomatic matter that has kept her awake half the night turning it over. Food at breakfast is fuel rather than pleasure, something to be managed quickly so the real work of the day can begin. This is worth pausing on, I think, because it stands in such contrast to the evening meal we watched earlier, the one where Elizabeth reached for stewed pears or what her lady recognized as genuine unguarded pleasure. Morning Elizabeth and evening Elizabeth were not quite the same woman, at least not as her household experienced her. Morning brought the weight of the day ahead, sharp and immediate. Evening brought, if she was fortunate, a little space to simply exist for an hour or two before sleep. Between breakfast and the grander midday meal, there was often a smaller pause, a moment where wine or a little bread might be brought to wherever Elizabeth happened to be working. And it is here in these smaller unofficial moments that cordials and medicinal preparations most often appeared. This is worth its own attention because food and medicine were not nearly as separate in this period as we tend to think of them now. A still room maintained by someone in the household with particular skill in this area produced waters and cordials distilled from herbs and flowers believed to settle the stomach, calm the nerves, or ease the particular aches or fatigues that came with age and overwork. Rose water, cordials flavored with mint or with a small hoard of citrus that had traveled such a long way to reach the palace. A warm posset milk curdled gently with wine or ale and sweetened with sugar, offered on evenings when Elizabeth's stomach seemed unsettled or when sleep had been difficult to find the night before. Maybe she is the woman responsible for this particular corner of the household's work. Quietly respected for a skill that sat somewhere between cooking and medicine, trusted with preparations that would be given directly to the Queen without the elaborate tasting rituals applied to ordinary dishes, because these smaller remedies came from hands already known and already trusted absolutely. I find something quietly moving in this, too. Even a queen, even a woman who commanded the resources of an entire kingdom, still reached in the end for the same things any of us might reach for on a difficult night. Something warm, something sweet, something familiar, prepared by someone who knew her well enough to get it exactly right without being told. Let's turn now to the meal that actually anchored the middle of the day, the one the household simply called dinner, taken sometime around midday, and considerably more substantial than the light breakfast that preceded it. Dinner taken at midday was where the household's culinary ambition truly showed itself. Even on days with no guests, no ambassadors, nothing performed for beyond the ordinary maintenance of royal dignity. This was a meal with the most dishes, the most variety, the clearest demonstration of everything those kitchens we walked through earlier had been preparing since before dawn. The service of this meal followed its own careful choreography, one that had almost nothing to do with simply carrying food from kitchen to table. Gentlemen, Ushers, men of relatively high status within the household hierarchy, oversaw the physical procession of dishes into the dining chamber, walking ahead of the servers carrying the actual food, their presence announcing that something important was approaching before a single plate had come into view. This mattered enormously in a world built almost entirely on visible hierarchy. The person who carried your food, the person who announced its arrival, the order in which dishes reached the table, all of it communicated status as clearly as any spoken word could have. A gentleman usher walking this route on an ordinary Tuesday might feel, if he is honest, a small private satisfaction in the formality of it, the sense of participating in something that connected him, however distantly, to centuries of English royal tradition. He does not carry the food himself. That work belongs to servers of somewhat lower rank, but his presence at the head of the procession is not decorative. It signals to anyone watching that what follows deserves attention and respect. The table itself, by the time everything arrived, would hold considerably more dishes than any single person could reasonably eat, even someone with a heartier appetite than Elizabeth generally displayed. Meat prepared several different ways, perhaps a roast alongside something stewed or baked into a pie. Fish of the day called for it, bread in its various grades. A selection of the season's vegetables, arranged more for visual balance than out of any real expectation that they would be eaten in quantity, and always somewhere on the table something sweet, whether stewed fruit or a small dish of sugared nuts or a delicate custard flavored with the spices kept so carefully locked away in that small room off the kitchen. Elizabeth's own consumption from this abundance remained, by most accounts, restrained. A portion here, a taste there, attention paid more to conversation, to the ladies and occasional guests seated near her, than to systematically working through the dishes laid before her. This was, in its own way, a form of power, too. The ability to be surrounded by more food than you could possibly want, and to simply not want it, said something about a person's position in the world that scarcity never could. Table linens for a meal like this were changed and laundered with a care that modern households rarely apply to anything. The finest cloth reserved entirely for the Queen's own table, bleached through careful and repeated washing until it achieved a whiteness that servants down the hierarchy simply never saw on their own more modest linens. A single knife sat beside Elizabeth's place, its handle sometimes decorated, its blade kept honed by someone whose entire job in part involved making sure the Queen's cutlery never embarrassed the household through carelessness. Fingers did the rest of the work that a knife could not, dipped afterward into a small bowl of water, scented lightly with herbs, then dried on a napkin held ready by an attentive lady, standing near enough to anticipate the need before it was voiced. I want to pause on that detail for a moment, the bowl of scented water, because it is such a small thing, and yet it tells you so much about how thoroughly this world had been organized around anticipating a single person's comfort. Someone somewhere in the household had decided which herbs should scent that water. Someone changed it fresh for every meal. Someone made absolutely certain it was warm rather than cold, because a queen should never have to notice the water was too cold to be pleasant. This is what extraordinary privilege actually looks like up close. Not one grand gesture, but hundreds of tiny, carefully maintained comforts, so consistent and so seamless that the person receiving them might barely register they were being given at all. Let's talk about the seasons for a while, because nothing shaped the Tudor kitchen more completely than the simple, unavoidable fact that most food could not be had year-round. Summer, the season we open in tonight, brought its own particular abundance. Soft fruits ripening quickly and needing to be used almost as fast as they arrived. Strawberries and cherries and the first plums, none of which could be reliably stored for more than a few days without spoiling. Fresh peas and beans from the kitchen gardens, tender and sweet in a way that would fade entirely once the season turned. Herbs at their most fragrant, cut fresh each morning, rather than relying on the dried stores kept for winter use. Winter told an entirely different story, and a cook working the royal kitchens in January faced a set of constraints that summer never demanded. Fresh vegetables largely disappeared, replaced by whatever had been carefully stored through the autumn. Root vegetables kept in cool dry cellars. Cabbages that could hold through the cold months if handled correctly. Meat, ironically, became somewhat easier to manage in winter since cold temperatures slowed spoilage naturally in a way summer heat never allowed. And this is part why so much livestock was traditionally slaughtered in late autumn, producing salted and preserved meat meant to carry a household through the leanest months. Preserved fruit, the kind we saw earlier sitting in ceramic jars deep in the palace cellars, became considerably more important once winter set in, and fresh fruit simply was not available at any price. Dried fruit, too, figs and raisins and currants, most of it imported, expensive, and treated with the same careful accounting applied to sugar and spice. A kitchen that had run generously through summer's natural abundance had to plan months ahead for a winter table that would need to feel nearly as rich despite having so much less fresh material to work with. Maybe she is a cook who has spent years learning exactly how to stretch a winter pantry convincingly, how to use spice and sugar and clever presentation to make a dish built from store-preserved ingredients feel every bit as impressive as something built from fresh summer produce. This is its own quiet skill, rarely celebrated, though it mattered enormously to a household that could not simply admit in the middle of February that the Queen's table looked a little thinner than it had in July. There is something almost architectural about how carefully the seasonal rhythm had to be planned. Nothing in this kitchen happened by accident. Every jar of preserved fruit, every side of salted meat, every careful decision about which vegetables could survive storage and which could not, represented weeks or months of foresight, executed by people whose names history mostly never bothered to record. Now, let's return for a while to the quieter hours, because I want to tell you about supper, the meal that closed the day, considerably lighter than the grand midday dinner we just walked through together. Supper arrived in the early evening, lighter than dinner, closer in spirit to the small private meal we watched Elizabeth take earlier tonight, though not always quite as intimate, depending on who happened to be at court and what the day had demanded of her. A typical supper might include some of the same dishes carried over from dinner, reheated or simply presented again, alongside something freshly prepared. Perhaps a light dish of eggs, or more of that stewed fruit the kitchen kept returning to throughout the day, because Elizabeth's fondness for it was so well understood by everyone responsible for feeding her. Bread, always bread in its careful grades, wine cut with water, and often by this hour a growing sense throughout the palace that the day's formal obligations were finally beginning to loosen their grip for the servants who had been working since before dawn. Supper marked something different entirely. A meal taken much further down the household hierarchy in kitchens and servants' halls rather than gilded private chambers, eaten quickly and without much ceremony before the evening's remaining work began. The kitchen boy who had turned that spit of beef so many hours earlier finally gets his own meal now. Coarser bread, a portion of ale, whatever meat or pottage the kitchen has set aside for the staff who kept the entire elaborate machine running all day. He eats standing mostly or perched on an overturned crate near the fire that has finally mercifully begun to cool. There's a kind of fairness in this and a kind of unfairness, too, both true at once. Every person in this palace eats tonight, from the Queen in her private chamber down to the youngest kitchen boy resting his aching arm near the fire. But the distance between what fills each of their plates in quality, in variety, in sheer luxury, remains enormous, and everyone involved understands this distance as simply the shape of the world they were born into, rarely questioned aloud, rarely even resented in any way that made its way into the historical record. As the light outside finally fades toward true evening, the pace in the kitchens begins at last to slow. Fires that have burned since before dawn are allowed to die down gradually rather than being fed for another full day's work. Pots are scrubbed, surfaces wiped clean. The spicery is locked again, its key returned to its careful keeper. Somewhere in the depths of the palace, a cellar makes its final rounds, checking that the casks are properly sealed for the night, that nothing has been left carelessly open to spoil. And upstairs, in Elizabeth's private rooms, the evening settles into something quieter still. Perhaps a little wine, a little conversation among her ladies, the low murmur of voices that has nothing urgent left to discuss. Perhaps on a night when sleep seems reluctant to come easily, that warm pose that we talked about earlier, milk and wine curdled gently together and sweetened just enough, brought in by the woman whose particular skill lay in knowing exactly what a tired body needed at the end of a long day. Maybe she is watching Elizabeth now in this final quiet hour and thinking, as she sometimes does, about how strange it is to know someone this intimately and yet not know her at all. She knows exactly how Elizabeth likes her wine poured. She does not know what actually occupies the Queen's mind in these quiet moments, what worries trail behind her into sleep, what she truly thinks about the enormous weight she carries every single day of her reign. That distance, that particular kind of closeness without true intimacy, is perhaps the strangest part of serving a monarch this closely. You see everything and understand almost nothing. Late that night, after Elizabeth has finally retired, a small crew of servants moves quietly through her private dining room, clearing away what remains of the evening. This is, in its own way, the most revealing moment of the entire day, though almost nobody outside this small circle ever thought to consider it that way. What was gone told its own story. The bread mostly finished, the stewed pears entirely gone, the dish scraped nearly clean, which told the lady clearing it that Elizabeth's appetite tonight had been genuine, unforced, the kind that comes when a person actually wants what is in front of them, rather than simply performing the motions of dining. The meat, though, sits largely untouched, only a few bites taken for what had been a generous portion. And this, too, tells its own quiet story, though its meaning is harder to read with any certainty. Perhaps she simply preferred the sweeter dish tonight. Perhaps her stomach had been unsettled. Perhaps the meat itself had not been prepared quite to her liking, though no complaint had been voiced, because complaints were rarely necessary in a household organized as carefully around anticipating preference before it needed to be spoken aloud. The servants clearing this table do not discuss what they observe. Not really, not in any formal way. But knowledge like this accumulates quietly over months and years, passed along almost by osmosis from one experienced servant to the next, until an entire unofficial understanding of the Queen's preferences exists, nowhere written down, held instead in the collective memory of the small circle of people who prepared and served and cleared her private meals. I find myself genuinely moved by this. Honestly, there is no official record anywhere describing Elizabeth's private appetite in the kind of intimate detail her servants carried in their own memories. The formal historical record gives us treaties and speeches, and the grand performance of a monarch who ruled for decades with extraordinary skill. It does not tell us, not really, that she scraped a dish of stewed pears clean on a warm evening in the summer of 1590 while barely touching the meat beside it. That detail lived and mostly died with the women who watched her eat. Let's leave this particular evening now and travel forward a little into a different season entirely, because I think it will help complete the picture we have been building together tonight. Winter, several years later, and the same kitchens we walked through earlier look and sound entirely different in the cold months. Fires burn just as constantly, perhaps more so, since warmth in these vast stone rooms mattered as much for comfort as for cooking. But the ingredients arriving through the palace gates each morning have changed completely. No baskets of fresh peas or bundles of damp summer herbs. Instead, carts arrive carrying root vegetables dug from cold storage, salted meat brought up from the cellars, whatever preserved fruit remains from the previous autumn's careful work. A different cook, or perhaps the same one we met earlier, now considerably more experienced, stands over a pot of pottage thickened with barley and flavored with whatever herbs survived the autumn drying, alongside a portion of salted pork that is soaked overnight to draw out some of its harshness. This is not glamorous food, not by the standards of the elaborate sugar sculptures we saw at that summer banquet, but it required its own genuine skill, coaxing real flavor and comfort out of a pantry considerably more limited than what summer had offered. Elizabeth's own winter table reflects this shift, too, though her household worked hard, as we discussed earlier, to make sure the difference never felt like true deprivation. Preserved fruit replaces fresh, spiced, and sweetened in ways that made the transition feel almost intentional rather than forced. Meat leans more heavily on what had been salted or smoked through the autumn, though fresh game, When huntsmen managed to bring some in, remain a welcome and celebrated exception during the colder months. And sugar, that expensive, carefully guarded resource becomes, if anything, more prominent in winter, since sweetness offered one of the few genuine luxuries that cold weather and limited fresh produce could not diminish. By this point in her reign, Elizabeth is older, and those who serve her closely have begun to notice small changes that came, as they come to everyone eventually with age. Her appetite, never robust even in her younger years, according to most accounts, grew somewhat more particular still. Certain dishes that had once tempted her now sat untouched more often, digestive troubles hinted at rather than documented in explicit detail by the sources that survive. Men, her ladies, and the household's physicians paid closer attention to what she ate and how her body responded to it. The cordials and posets from that still room we visited earlier took on a slightly more medicinal purpose, now less about simple comfort, and more about genuinely easing complaints that came with the demands of ruling a kingdom for decades, while the body beneath the crown continued quietly and inevitably to age. Maybe she is a lady who has served Elizabeth since both of them were considerably younger, and who now watches this slow change with a kind of tender attentiveness that never announces itself as concern, because concern expressed too openly was not really something a monarch of this era welcomed from those who served her. Instead, it shows itself sideways in small adjustments. A dish quietly removed from rotation because it no longer seemed to agree with the queen. A particular cordial kept always ready just in case. Extra care taken that meals arrive warm rather than merely adequate, because warmth on a cold winter evening mattered more to an aging body than it once had. This is, I think, one of the quieter truths this whole story keeps circling back to. Power does not exempt a person from the ordinary realities of a body growing older. Elizabeth commanded fleets and outmaneuvered the most powerful monarchs in Europe. And she also, in the end, simply got tired sometimes, and simply lost her appetite sometimes, and simply needed a warm drink and an early night sometimes, the same as anyone eventually does. Let's shift now to something a little different, because I promised you earlier we would return to the sugar work, and I think this is the right moment. Somewhere in a room set slightly apart from the main kitchen, warm, but not nearly as fiercely hot as the rooms full of roasting fires, a confectioner works sugar the way a sculptor works stone. Sugar in this period did not arrive as the fine, easily poured substance we know now. It came in hard cones, refined through a laborious process before it ever reached England, and had to be broken down, ground, and worked by hand into whatever form particular dish required. For simple sweetening, this meant careful grinding into something close to a coarse powder. For the elaborate centerpieces that impressed visitors at grand banquets, it meant something considerably more ambitious. Marchpane, a sweet paste made from ground almonds and sugar, could be shaped almost like clay once properly worked, molded into elaborate forms, and sometimes painted afterward with food-safe colors to heighten the effect. A confectioner skilled in this work might spend an entire day shaping a single elaborate piece. A castle, perhaps, complete with tiny towers and a painted flag, or an animal rendered in startling, almost lifelike detail. All of it entirely edible. All of it destined to sit on a banquet table purely, to be admired before anyone touched it with a knife. This was not idle luxury exactly, though it looked exactly like luxury to anyone watching. Sugar work of this kind functioned as a genuine demonstration of wealth and sophistication, a way of showing guests, and more importantly, showing rival courts through reports carried home by visiting ambassadors exactly how much resource and skill a household could command. Every marchpane castle was in its own sweet edible way a small piece of diplomacy, the confectioner responsible for tonight's piece. A woman who trained for years under someone considerably more senior before earning the trust to work independently on pieces destined for Queen's own table, works with total concentration, pressing the sweet almond paste into a mold, smoothing its surface with careful fingers, setting it aside to firm before she begins the delicate work of painting details onto its surface. She takes genuine pride in this work, the kind of quiet pride that comes from doing something difficult extremely well, even knowing that her elaborate creation might survive only long enough to be admired for a few minutes before someone cuts into it, or worse, before it simply gets left largely untouched the way so much banquet food ultimately was. I think there is something worth noticing in the sheer effort poured into things designed to be looked at rather than truly consumed. It tells you in its own way what this world actually valued. Not nourishment. Not really. Not at the level of a grand feast. The careful cultivation of an image of limitless abundance built by the patient, skilled hands of people whose own names rarely survive in any record beyond a scattered household account book listing. Wages paid for confectionery work. Let's talk for a while about ingredients that would have seemed genuinely strange or exotic even to the wealthiest people at Elizabeth's court, because the world was beginning during her reign to open up in ways that slowly reshaped what an English table might contain. Exploration and trade were beginning across Elizabeth's reign to bring genuinely new foods into England, those slowly and often first to the tables of the very wealthy before they trickled down decades or even centuries later to ordinary households. The potato, for instance, was only beginning to make its uncertain way into English awareness during this period. Unfamiliar enough that it would take considerably longer than Elizabeth's lifetime before it became the everyday staple we know now. Turkey, brought originally from the Americas, had already begun appearing on wealthy English tables by this point. Considered something of a novelty still, a striking alternative to the more traditional roasted birds a kitchen might otherwise prepare. Citrus fruits, oranges, and lemons remained genuinely exotic and expensive imports, treated with the same careful accounting we saw applied to sugar and spice. Each piece of fruit representing weeks of travel and considerable expense before it ever reached a palace kitchen. A merchant delivering a small crate of oranges to the palace gates one autumn morning knows exactly how much this delivery is worth and handles it with a care that borders on reverence. These fruits travel from considerably further away than most of what filled the royal kitchens, carried by ship through routes that could take weeks, packed carefully to prevent spoilage, and a single damaged crate represented a genuine financial loss that no one wanted attached to their name. Elizabeth's household, ever alert to anything that might impress or delight, incorporated these newer ingredients where it made sense. Candied orange peel finding its way into the same jars we saw earlier in the palace cellars, a rare dish of turkey, occasionally replacing a more familiar goose or capon at a banquet meant to particularly impress a visiting dignitary. But these remained genuine novelties throughout Elizabeth's reign, expensive curiosities rather than everyday fare, and the vast majority of what filled her table night after night remained the more traditional English ingredients that had fed English royalty for centuries before her. I think it is worth pausing here to notice how carefully this world balanced novelty against tradition. A truly modern ingredient deployed without care might have seemed strange or even suspicious to a court still deeply attached to established custom. But a rare, expensive novelty, deployed thoughtfully at exactly the right moment, could enhance a queen's reputation for sophistication, without ever threatening the deeper traditions her household continued to honor every single day. Now, let's turn our attention for a while to the women who surrounded Elizabeth most closely during meals, because I promised earlier we would spend real time on the social world that existed alongside all this food, and I think this is exactly the right moment. The ladies of Elizabeth's privy chamber occupied a genuinely unusual position within the wider court. They were not, strictly speaking, servants. In the way the kitchen staff we have spent so much time with tonight were servants. Many came from noble families themselves, attending the Queen not primarily for wages, but for the immense prestige and access that came with proximity to the monarch. And yet, within the private dining rooms we have visited tonight, their role blurred that distinction considerably, because someone had to pour the wine, someone had to anticipate which dish Elizabeth might reach for next, someone had to manage the small, constant choreography of a private meal, and these tasks fell to women whose birth might otherwise have placed them well above ordinary domestic service. Maybe she is a lady drawn from a respected but not especially wealthy family, sent to court by parents who understood correctly that proximity to the Queen could shape an entire family's fortunes for a generation. She arrived young, uncertain the countless unwritten rules governing this world, and learned quickly that survival here depended less on any single dramatic moment, and more on 1,000 small accumulated impressions. How gracefully she poured wine. Whether she remembered without being reminded that Elizabeth preferred her cup filled only part way. Whether she could read the Queen's mood accurately enough to know when conversation was welcome and when silence served better. The relationship among these women tucked so closely together into Elizabeth's daily private life carried their own complicated currents that rarely appear in formal historical accounts, but almost surely shape the atmosphere of every meal we have described tonight. Some genuine friendships formed built over years of shared proximity to a woman who could be by most accounts both demanding and genuinely warm depending on the day and the circumstance. Some quieter rivalries existed, too, inevitable in any group of ambitious people competing, even subtly, for a monarch's favor and attention. A lady who consistently anticipated Elizabeth's preferences correctly earned a particular kind of quiet status among her peers, while one who fumbled, who poured wine too quickly, or offered a dish Elizabeth had recently tired of, might find herself, without any harsh words ever being spoken, gently eased toward less prominent duties. I find this world of unspoken hierarchy genuinely fascinating, honestly, because it operated almost entirely through implication rather than explicit rule. Nobody handed a new lady a written list of Elizabeth's preferences. She learned by watching, by making small mistakes, and quietly correcting them, by absorbing an entire body of accumulated household knowledge that existed nowhere except in the collective memory of the women who had served longest. And within this world, meals themselves became a kind of social theater in miniature, considerably smaller and gentler than the grand public banquets we explored earlier, but theater nonetheless, where a lady stood during dinner, whether she was invited to sit briefly near the Queen or remained standing throughout, whether Elizabeth addressed her directly, asked her opinion on some small matter, or simply allowed her to move quietly through her duties unacknowledged. Every meal carried these small currents of status and favor running beneath its calm surface, invisible to anyone who had not spent years learning to read them. Let's step away from the lady for a moment and spend a little time on something more physical, more tangible, because I think the objects themselves deserve their own attention tonight. The plate that held Elizabeth's food, quite literally, mattered enormously in this world, and the household maintained an extensive collection of silver, and for the very highest occasions, gilt vessels reserved entirely for her use. Ordinary trenchers, thick slices of bread used in earlier centuries as edible plates, had by Elizabeth's reign largely given way at the highest levels of court to proper plate made from precious metal, though the older tradition persisted further down the household hierarchy, where servants might still eat from simpler wooden trenchers or plain pewter. A servant responsible for maintaining this silver understood that a single tarnished or poorly polished piece set before the Queen would reflect badly not on the metal itself, but on the entire household's competence. And so this work, unglamorous as it sounds, carried its own genuine weight. Hours spent polishing, checking, arranging, all so that when a dish finally reached Elizabeth's table, everything surrounding it, the plate beneath it, the cup beside it, the knife resting near her hand, gleamed with a consistency that made the whole presentation feel effortless, even though effortlessness here required an enormous, largely invisible amount of labor. Let's walk through one particular evening now a little more vividly than we have moved through the general rhythm of an ordinary day, because I think it will help pull together everything we have explored so far tonight. A foreign ambassador has arrived at court representing a kingdom whose relationship with England remains at this particular moment delicately balanced between friendship and rivalry, and Elizabeth has decided that tonight's dinner will be conducted with particular care. Word travels through the kitchens well before the meal itself, carried by the officers responsible for such planning, and the entire household shifts its energy accordingly. This is not simply about preparing more food, though considerably more food will indeed be prepared. It is about preparing exactly the right food, dishes chosen deliberately to communicate something about English wealth, English sophistication, English hospitality, without ever tipping into anything that might read as either stinginess or desperate overreach. Every course tonight has been considered, discussed, sometimes debated among the officers responsible for the Queen's household, Because a banquet like this functions as a form of communication every bit as real as any letter or formal negotiation. The confectioner we met earlier has been given considerably more advance notice than usual, and her sugar work tonight will be more ambitious than anything she produces for an ordinary feast. Something specifically designed to impress a visitor from a kingdom she has never seen and likely never will. She works with particular focus, aware that whatever she creates tonight might well be described later. In a letter this ambassador sends home to his own monarch, a small piece of her craft carried across the sea in someone else's written account of English splendor in the great hall itself. Extra care has gone into the arrangement of the tables, the placement of the ambassador's seat close enough to the Queen's own to signal genuine respect, but positioned carefully within the room's broader hierarchy, so that no one present could mistake the relationship for something more equal than it actually was. Every detail of seating, in a world as attentive to hierarchy, carried meaning, and the officers responsible for tonight's arrangement have thought through each placement with the same seriousness a modern diplomat might bring to seating at an international summit. Elizabeth, when she finally enters, does so with all the calculated grace that public occasions demanded of her, and the meal that follows unfolds according to the elaborate choreography we described earlier. Dish after dish carried in by gentlemen ushers, presented with theatrical care, admired, tasted, sometimes barely touched. The ambassador, watching this display with the practiced eye of a man who has attended similar occasions at courts across Europe, understands exactly what is being shown, and understands too that his own reports home will need to capture as accurately as he can manage exactly how impressive this English hospitality truly was. Maybe she is a lady standing near enough to observe the ambassador's genuine reactions rather than his polite ones. The small flicker of real surprise when the sugar sculpture arrives. The brief hesitation before he tastes a dish flavored with spices considerably more generous than anything his own court's kitchens typically used. These small, honest reactions, invisible to most of the room, tell her something the formal diplomatic exchanges never quite reveal, that England, whatever its political struggles, still knew exactly how to make an impression when it mattered. And beneath all this theater, beneath the sugar sculptures and the careful seating and the elaborate procession of dishes, Elizabeth herself once again eats relatively little. Her attention split between genuine diplomatic engagement and the constant exhausting work of being watched by someone whose opinion of her carried home in careful written reports could shape how an entire foreign court perceived English strength and stability for years to come. Let's return for a moment to the man whose job it was to taste Elizabeth's food before anyone else touched it, because I think his particular perspective on all of this deserves more time than we gave it earlier. He has held this position for years now, long enough that the initial nervousness he felt in his first months has settled into something closer to quiet routine, though never entirely, because a role built around protecting a monarch from poison cannot ever become fully casual. Not really. Not if a person takes the responsibility seriously. He tastes dozens of small portions across a single day, from the plainest pottage served to lower members of the household up through the most elaborate dishes destined for Elizabeth's own table. And over the years he has developed an almost instinctive sense for when something tastes even slightly wrong. A bitterness that should not be there. A sharpness that does not match what the dish should taste like. Interestingly, he has never actually caught anything, not in all his years of service. And there is a particular kind of tension in that fact that most people never think to consider. Every single day, he performs a task built entirely around a danger that has, in his own personal experience, never once materialized. Does that make the danger less real? Or does it simply mean the precautions have worked exactly as they were designed to work, quietly preventing a threat that never gets a chance to become a story? He genuinely does not know the answer, and has stopped trying to work it out during the long, uneventful stretches of an ordinary evening. What he does know beyond any real doubt is the Queen herself, at least in the narrow sense that comes from tasting nearly everything she eats before she does. He knows which dishes make repeated appearances on her table, because she genuinely enjoys them. He knows a particular blend of spice used in her favorite stewed fruit, having sampled it so many times. He could likely recreate it from memory alone. He has, in a strange and rarely acknowledged way, one of the most intimate relationships with Elizabeth's private tastes of anyone in the entire palace, and yet he has almost never exchanged more than a handful of words with her directly in his entire career. This, I think, captures something genuinely important about the world we have been exploring tonight. Intimacy and distance existed side by side in the strangest configurations. A man who literally put a portion of the Queen's own food into his own mouth before she did, who understood her palate more thoroughly than almost anyone at court, remained, in every social sense that mattered, a stranger to her, invisible in ways servants so often were, present at the most private moments of her day, and yet entirely absent from her actual awareness. Let's talk, too, about what happened on the occasions when Elizabeth's health genuinely faltered, because these moments reshaped the kitchen's entire approach, however briefly, and reveal something further about how carefully food and well-being were understood to be connected in this period when illness struck. Whether a passing cold, a troubled stomach, or something more serious that kept her confined to her room for days at a time, the household physicians worked closely with the kitchen to adjust what she was offered. Rich, heavy dishes disappeared from her table almost entirely during these periods, replaced by simpler believed to be gentler on a struggling body. Thin broths, carefully strained barley water, believed by physicians of this era to soothe and cool an overheated constitution, small portions of easily digested foods, offered frequently rather than in the larger, more substantial meals that structure her ordinary healthy days. A cook working during one of these periods of illness felt the pressure differently than during an ordinary week. There was no room here for theatrical excessive banquet, no opportunity to impress through spectacle. The entire goal narrowed down to a single urgent question: what might genuinely help her feel better? And this narrower, more focused kind of cooking required its own particular skill, an ability to coax real comfort and nourishment out of the simplest possible ingredients, prepared with a gentleness that more elaborate dishes never demanded. I want to take you somewhere different for a while now, because Elizabeth did not spend her entire reign inside a single palace, and the logistics of feeding her changed considerably whenever the court packed up and moved royal progresses. The extended summer journeys during which Elizabeth traveled to the countryside, staying at the great houses of nobles wealthy enough and honored enough to host her, created an entirely different kind of culinary challenge than anything we have discussed tonight so far. A host family receiving word that the Queen intended to visit understood, with a mixture of genuine honor and genuine terror, that they would be expected to feed her or her household, and a substantial portion of her traveling court for days, or sometimes weeks at a time, to a standard that would not embarrass them in front of a monarch known for noticing exactly this kind of detail. Families ruined themselves financially preparing for these visits. More than one household, spending sums that took years to recover from, all in pursuit of a single glowing memory of royal favor that might, if they were fortunate, translate into genuine political advantage down the line. Kitchens were expanded temporarily. Additional cooks brought in from surrounding areas. Local suppliers pressed into providing whatever delicacies the region could offer, all in service of a visit that might last only a handful of days before the entire traveling court packed up again and moved on to the next honored household. Maybe she is the mistress of one such household, watching her own kitchen staff work themselves to exhaustion, preparing for a royal visit that will determine in some very real sense how her family is remembered at court for years afterward. She has spent months planning this, corresponded with officers of the Queen's household about dietary preferences, about which dishes might particularly please Elizabeth, gathering information the way a general might gather intelligence before a decisive battle. The stakes feel to her genuinely that high. Elizabeth's own household traveled with a portion of its usual apparatus intact, certain trusted cooks and servants accompanying her rather than relying entirely on whatever local staff a host family provided. And this created its own interesting friction, local cooks eager to showcase regional specialties, working alongside royal servants who understood better than anyone exactly what the Queen actually preferred to eat on an ordinary evening. Sometimes these collaborations produced genuinely wonderful results, A regional dish reimagined slightly to suit royal taste, a local delicacy that ended up becoming a favorite Elizabeth requested again on future visits. Sometimes, inevitably, there was tension. The host family's ambitious dish quietly declined in favor of something simpler and more familiar that Elizabeth's own trusted servants knew she would actually enjoy. I find something genuinely touching in this, too. Honestly, the idea that even amid all this elaborate performance and political calculation, what Elizabeth actually wanted in the end remained something fairly simple and consistent. Good bread, something sweet, meat prepared without excessive fuss, whatever comfort her own trusted servants, wherever in England they happen to find themselves, could manage to provide. Let's come back now from the countryside to the palace itself and spend a little more time in the quiet hours of the night, because I think there's more to say about what happened after Elizabeth had finally gone to sleep. The palace at night was never entirely still. Not really, though it grew quieter in ways that would have felt almost startling to anyone who had spent the day amid its usual daytime noise and motion. Watchmen moved slowly through the corridors, carrying small lanterns whose light barely reached the high stone ceilings above them, checking doors, checking that fires banked down for the night had not been left carelessly, checking that everything remained exactly as it should. Somewhere below, in the kitchens that had roared with heat and noise since before dawn, the last fires glowed down to embers, tended by a single servant, whose job was to keep them just alive enough to be built back up quickly the following morning, sparing the household the slower, more laborious work of starting entirely from cold. In the cellars, the wine and ale sat in careful darkness, undisturbed until morning, and the faint sound of water somewhere deep in the stone foundations provided the only real noise in that particular part of the palace, a slow, steady dripping that had probably been audible in that exact spot for centuries before Elizabeth was ever born, and would likely continue long after her reign ended, too. Upstairs in Elizabeth's private rooms, a lady sat awake a little longer than the others, as was sometimes required, in case the Queen woke and needed something in the deep hours of the night. This was not unusual duty, not really. Simply part of the quiet, unglamorous reality of serving a monarch closely, and she had grown accustomed over the years to these long stretches of watchful stillness, listening to Elizabeth's breathing settle into the steady rhythm of genuine sleep before allowing her own attention to relax even slightly. I find something worth sitting with in this particular image. A woman awake in the dark, listening to another woman breathe, ready to fetch warm milk or a cordial or simply a blanket at a moment's notice, asking nothing in return except the privilege, if you could call it that, of remaining close to power. It says something about how thoroughly this world had organized itself around a single person's comfort, that even sleep, even the most private and vulnerable hours of the day, required someone standing quietly nearby, ready, and yet there is something almost peaceful in this particular kind of watching, too, if you sit with it long enough. Not the anxious vigilance of the tasters we spent time with earlier, alert to danger in every dish. Something gentler, a woman simply present, simply attentive, in the way anyone might sit quietly near someone they cared for, wanted to be there if they were needed, content to wait in the dark if they were not. Morning would come again soon enough. The ovens relit, the spicery unlocked, the entire elaborate machine of feeding a queen beginning once more, exactly as it had the morning before and the morning before that, stretching back through years of Elizabeth's long reign in a rhythm so consistent it had become for everyone involved, simply the shape of ordinary life. Let's talk a little more about the formal etiquette surrounding Elizabeth's meals, because there was a whole quiet language of gesture and ritual surrounding even the simple act of washing one's hands before eating, and I think it deserves its own attention tonight. Before any meal began, water was brought for washing, carried in a beautifully worked basin, and poured over the hands by an attendant whose specific duty this was. The water itself often scented lightly with rose water or another gentle fragrance. This was not merely practical hygiene, though it served that purpose too in a period before eating utensils had fully replaced fingers as the primary tool for managing food. It was ceremony performed with real formality, the pouring of the water and the offering of fine cloth for drying, conducted according to an order that reflected precisely who held precedence in a room. Elizabeth washed first always, and the attendant performing the small ritual understood that the grace and confidence with which she carried out this simple task, pouring water steadily, offering the cloth at exactly the right moment, reflected directly on her own competence, and by extension on the entire household's reputation for proper service. A clumsy pour, water spilled carelessly, a cloth offered a beat too late. These small failures would be noticed, remembered, perhaps even mentioned quietly among the other ladies later. Precedents governed nearly everything about how a formal meal unfolded, who sat where, who was served first, who stood, and who was permitted to sit. All of it calibrated with an exactness that seems to modern eyes almost exhausting to maintain. But within this world, that exactness served a genuine purpose. It made the entire structure of society visible, legible, something everyone present could read at a glance, simply by observing where each person stood or sat in relation to everyone else. Confusion about precedence was not merely embarrassing. It represented in miniature a small crack in the entire visible order that held this world together. Maybe she is a young lady, newly arrived at court, still learning these countless small rules, mortified after a minor stumble, perhaps offering a dish to the wrong person first, or standing a half step too close to where etiquette demanded she remain. Nobody scolds her harshly for such a mistake. Not usually, but she feels the weight of it anyway. The quiet awareness that everyone in the room noticed and the determination afterward never to make quite that particular mistake again. I think what strikes me most about all of the ceremony is how much emotional labor it demanded from everyone involved constantly, without ever being acknowledged as labor at all. Reading a room's hierarchy correctly, anticipating precisely what was expected at every moment, performing grace and confidence even while genuinely uncertain. This was its own exhausting skill developed over years, rarely celebrated, and yet absolutely essential to the smooth functioning of every single meal we have described tonight. Let's move now toward the grandest feast of the entire year, the one that tested every kitchen skill we have discussed tonight simultaneously, because I think Christmas deserves real attention before we begin easing toward the close of tonight's story. Christmas at the Elizabethan court represented the single largest culinary undertaking the royal household attempted each year. A season of feasting that stretched across nearly 12 days, each with its own particular traditions and expectations. The kitchens we walked through earlier at the very start of tonight's journey would in the weeks leading up to the season shift into an entirely different gear, planning and gathering ingredients on a scale that dwarfed even the ambassador's banquet we spent time with earlier. A boar's head elaborately dressed and carried into the great hall with genuine ceremony remained a beloved traditional centerpiece for this season. Its presentation accompanied by carols specifically associated with the occasion sung as the dish made its procession toward the high table. Enormous quantities of meat, considerably more varied than an ordinary banquet might offer, arrived from kitchens working at absolute capacity, supplemented by game brought in specifically for the occasion, venison and wildfowl that appeared on the table far less frequently during the rest of the year. Spiced wine, warm and fragrant, replaced the ordinary cut wine served on quieter evenings, and the spicery, that small locked room we visited earlier, would have been open and drawn from more heavily during these weeks than at almost any other point in the entire year. Twelfth Night, closing out the Christmas season, brought its own particular tradition, a special cake baked with a hidden bean or token inside it, and whoever found that token in their portion was declared for the remainder of the evening. A kind of temporary monarch of the festivities permitted small liberties and jokes that would have been unthinkable at any other point in the year. This tradition, playful and genuinely beloved throughout English society at every level, even found its way into the royal household's own celebrations. Though how exactly it was handled when Elizabeth herself was present, given her actual sovereignty, offers an interesting question that historical sources treat with varying degrees of detail and certainty. A confectioner preparing this particular cake understood the weight of getting it exactly right, not merely in flavor, but in the placement of that hidden token, worked carefully into the batter, so it would not be discovered too easily, nor missed entirely by whoever's portion happened to contain it. There was real artistry in this small, playful detail, a moment of genuine levity built into an otherwise formal and hierarchical world. Throughout these 12 days, the household's ordinary rhythm shifted considerably. More guests than usual filled the great hall most evenings. More servants worked longer hours than they would during quieter stretches of the year, and the kitchen staff, exhausted by the sheer volume of work, nonetheless carried particular kind of pride to this demanding season, aware that Christmas at court represented the single clearest demonstration each year of everything their skill and labor could produce when given the resources and occasion to truly show off. Maybe she is a servant who has worked this particular season for many years now and who has come to genuinely love it despite the exhaustion, because there is something in the collective effort of it. The entire household pulling together toward a shared goal that feels different from the ordinary daily grind of feeding the court on an unremarkable Tuesday. The Christmas kitchens, chaotic and overwhelming as they are, carry a kind of warmth in them, too. The particular camaraderie that comes from shared hard work towards something everyone involved can take genuine pride in. And Elizabeth herself, moving through these 12 days of feasting and ceremony, performed the role expected of her, with the same practiced grace she brought to every public occasion, though those closest to her, the ladies who had spent years learning to read her smallest gestures, could still sometimes catch a flicker of genuine warmth beneath the ceremony, a moment of real laughter during the 12th night festivities, a genuine appreciation for a particularly well-made dish that briefly cracked the careful performance every public meal otherwise demanded of her. We have covered a great deal of ground together tonight, and I want to start easing us gently toward the close now, though there is still more I want to share with you before we get there. Actually, let me pull us back for a while because there's another whole corner off this world we have not properly explored yet, and I think it deserves its place in tonight's story before we finally let the evening close. The buttery, a room we passed through only briefly earlier tonight, deserves more attention, because ale, more than wine, more even than bread, formed the true daily backbone of what an English household of this era actually drank, brewed on site in vast quantities. Ale was consumed by nearly everyone in the palace, at nearly every meal in amounts that would seem startling by modern standards, though the ale itself was typically considerably weaker than what we might associate with the word today, closer in strength to what we might now call a light beer, safe to drink in quantity throughout the day without the effects we would expect from stronger modern brewing. A brewer working within the royal household held a position of genuine importance, responsible for a beverage consumed constantly by hundreds of people across the palace each day. And any failure in the brewing process, a batch turned sour or improperly made, could disrupt the entire household's basic daily comfort in a way that a single poorly cooked dish never could. He worked with barley, malted and prepared according to methods passed down through generations of brewers before him, and the smell of his work, yeasty and slightly sweet, mingled throughout the lower levels of the palace with the woodsome smoke and roasting meat we encountered at the very start of tonight's journey. Elizabeth herself, as we discussed earlier, favored wine over ale for her own private drinking, cut generously with water, in a habit that several visitors to her court noted with something close to admiration, given and how much more heavily some of her contemporaries across Europe were known to drink. But ale remained the drink of her wider household, the fuel that kept an enormous working staff moving through their long, physically demanding days, and the brewer's steady, unglamorous work sat quietly beneath everything else we had described tonight, essential and almost entirely unnoticed. Let's talk, too, about the household officers who oversaw all of this, because we have spent so much time with the hands, actually doing the work, that I want to give at least a little space to those responsible for organizing it. A steward or sometimes several officers working in coordination, depending on how the household happened to be structured at any given point in Elizabeth's long reign, oversaw the enormous logistical challenge of provisioning, budgeting, and coordinating everything we have walked through together tonight. This was genuinely complex administrative work, tracking what had been purchased, what remained in storage, what needed replenishing, all while balancing the household's genuine desire for abundance against the very real costs involved in maintaining a royal table at this scale. Someone holding such a position spent as much of his day with ledgers and correspondence as any modern administrator might. Tracking expenses that could across a full year represent a truly enormous sum of the crown's resources, and understanding better than almost anyone else in the palace exactly how much this daily performance of abundance actually cost. He rarely appears in the more romantic accounts of royal dining that survive from this period. And yet, without his careful, unglamorous work, none of the spectacle we have described tonight could have happened at all. Let's go back into the kitchen one more time tonight, because I want to walk you through the making of a single elaborate pie slowly in the kind of detail that I think captures just how much labor lived inside even one dish among the dozens prepared each day. A raised pie. Its pastry shell, built tall and freestanding rather than resting in a dish, required particular skill to construct properly. The pastry worked while still warm enough to hold its shape, but sturdy enough to stand on its own once cooled, built up around a wooden mold that would later be removed once the structure had firmed. Inside, layers of meat, perhaps venison, brought in specifically for the occasion, seasoned generously with the spices we visited earlier, arranged carefully to ensure even cooking throughout the pie's considerable bulk. Sometimes fruit found its way into these pies, too, a mixture of sweet and savory that might seem unusual to modern taste, but represented in this period a genuinely celebrated combination. The woman constructing this particular pie has built hundreds like it over her years in this kitchen, and her hands move with the confidence of long practice. Pressing the pastry into shape, layering the filling with careful attention to how it will cook, sealing the top with a lattice of decorative pastry work that will, once baked, turn a deep golden brown and catch candlelight beautifully when the finished pie makes its procession to whatever table it has been destined for. She works quickly but never carelessly, aware that a single crack in the pastry shell during construction could mean disaster hours later. Filling leaking out during the long baking time ahead. Once assembled, the pie moves to the ovens where it will bake for hours at a carefully managed heat, checked periodically by someone whose entire responsibility for this stretch of the day is monitoring exactly this kind of long, slow cooking. Too hot, and the pastry shell might scorch before the filling is properly cooked through. Too cool, and hours could pass without the interior ever reaching a safe, fully cooked state. This kind of patient attention, unglamorous and largely invisible, represents exactly the kind of skilled labor that made the elaborate presentations we have discussed throughout tonight actually possible. When it finally emerges, golden and fragrant, the pie will be inspected carefully before anyone considers it ready for procession toward whatever table has been designated to receive it. And if it happens to be destined for Elizabeth's own private table, rather than the wider household, it will pass like everything else we have followed tonight to the careful tasting ritual before ever reaching her directly. I find myself even now genuinely admiring the sheer accumulated skill represented in a single dish like this. Hundreds of small decisions made by hands that had practiced this exact work for years, converging into something that Elizabeth might enjoy for a matter of minutes before moving on to whatever else caught her attention that particular evening. There is something almost melancholy in that imbalance, and something quietly beautiful in it too, depending on how you choose to look at it. Let's spend a little time now with Elizabeth in her later years, gently, because I think this part of the story deserves care rather than drama by the final years of her long reign. Elizabeth had become to the wider world something closer to legend than woman, a figure whose actual physical presence most of her subjects would never witness firsthand, known instead through portraits carefully composed to preserve an image of eternal, unchanging majesty. But to the small circle of servants who continued preparing and serving her private meals, she remained, of course, a real person, aging the way any of us eventually do, and the household around her adjusted quietly, continuously to meet her changing needs. Her appetite, according to accounts left by those who observe her closely during these final years, had grown noticeably lighter than even the modest habits we described earlier in her reign. Meals became simpler, smaller, chosen with even more careful attention to what her body could comfortably manage. The sweet dishes she had always favored remained present, that particular fondness for sugar apparently never leaving her, even as so much else about her daily habits shifted with age, though even these were offered now in smaller, gentler portions. Maybe she is a lady who has served Elizabeth for the better part of 3 decades by this point. Watching a woman she has known essentially her entire adult life move through these final years with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else. There is no dramatic scene here, no single moment decline that this lady could point to and say, "Here, everything changed." Only the slow, gradual accumulation of small differences, a little less eaten at each meal, a little more time needed to recover after a long day of official duties, a little more reliance on the warm posits and gentle cordials that had once been occasional comforts, and had now become something closer to daily necessity. I think what strikes me most, sitting with this part of the story, is how completely ordinary it actually is. Underneath everything else we have explored tonight, strip away the crown, the silver plate, the elaborate sugar sculptures, and the careful diplomatic theater of public banquets, and what remains is simply a woman growing older, cared for by people who come to know her in their own particular way, more intimately than almost anyone else in England ever would. Her ladies adjusted her meals not because a physician issued a formal directive, though sometimes they did, but because they had spent years learning to read her and could see in small daily signs exactly what she needed before she ever had to ask. This, I think, is perhaps the truest thing this whole story has to offer. However much power a person holds, however elaborate the machinery built up around them, in the end, what actually sustains them day after day, meal after meal, comes down to something remarkably simple. People who pay attention, people who notice, people who care enough to get the small things right, consistently, quietly, without ever needing to be thanked for it. Let's go back one more time to the question of safety, because I think there is more worth saying about how deeply this fear of poison shaped the physical architecture of feeding a monarch beyond a single taster we spent time with earlier. Every stage of food preparation, from the moment ingredients arrived at the palace gates through to the final moment a dish reached Elizabeth's table, involved layers of accountability designed specifically to make tampering as difficult as possible. Kitchen staff worked under the watchful presence of more senior officers, whose job included simply observing, making certain that no one handling the Queen's food acted alone or unwatched for any meaningful stretch of time. Dishes once prepared were covered immediately and remained covered throughout their journey through the palace corridors, removed only at the final moment before tasting and serving, denying any opportunity for something to be added along the way without immediate detection. The servants permitted to carry food this final stretch toward Elizabeth's private rooms were not chosen randomly. They were known thoroughly trusted through years of service, their loyalty considered established beyond reasonable doubt before they were ever given this particular responsibility. A newer servant, however skilled in the kitchen, would not simply be handed this final, most sensitive stage of the process. Trust in this world had to be earned slowly through years of consistent careful work before someone was permitted anywhere near the most vulnerable moments of the Queen's day. I think it is worth remembering sitting with all of this tonight that these precautions existed because the fear behind them was entirely reasonable, grounded in a world where political violence, including poisoning, was documented and real danger faced by monarchs across Europe throughout this period. This was not paranoid theater. It was in its own way simply prudent management of a genuine risk woven so thoroughly into the daily rhythm of feeding Elizabeth that most of the people involved likely stopped consciously thinking about it most days, the way any of us stop, consciously thinking about locking a door we lock automatically every single night. And yet underneath all this careful protection sat something quietly poignant too, a woman who could trust almost no one entirely, who required an entire elaborate system of covered dishes and careful tasting and closely watched corridors, simply to eat her dinner in safety night after night for the length of an extraordinarily long reign. That is its own kind of isolation, invisible beneath the abundance and ceremony we have spent so much of tonight exploring together. Let's shift gently to something warmer, because I do not want to leave you with only that thought tonight. And there is more comfort in this story than fear if you know where to look for it. Think for a moment about the sheer number of people whose entire working lives were organized in some way around making sure Elizabeth felt cared for. The gardener who grew her favorite pears, the confectioner who shaped sugar into shapes meant to delight her, the lady who knew exactly how much water to cut into her wine, the woman in the still room who understood precisely which cordial might ease a difficult night. None of these people acted out of simple obligation alone. Many of them, according to what evidence survives, took genuine pride and even genuine affection into this work, building an entire quiet architecture care around a woman who carried every single day burdens that most of them could barely imagine. Let's return for a while to the coast, because I promised earlier that we would spend more time with the fish that filled so many of Elizabeth's fasting day meals. And I think there is genuine richness in this part of the story we have not fully explored yet. Oysters, as we mentioned earlier, were remarkably plentiful along much of the English coastline during this period, harvested in quantities that would seem almost unimaginable by modern standards, and consumed across every level of society, from the poorest laborers, who gathered them freely along the shore, to the Queen's own table, where they appear prepared with rather more ceremony. A fishmonger supplying the royal household understood that oysters destined for Elizabeth's table needed to arrive fresher, cleaner, more carefully sorted than the ordinary catch sold in any market stall. And he built his entire reputation over years of steady work on never once delivering anything less than his absolute best at the palace gates. Prepared for the Queen's table, oysters might be served simply, freshly opened and dressed with little more than a touch of vinegar or a light sauce, or incorporated into more elaborate dishes, stewed gently with butter and a careful hand of spice. Either way, they represented exactly the kind of ingredient this world prized. Something genuinely delicious that also happened to be relatively accessible, allowing a kitchen to offer real abundance on a fasting day without needing to rely entirely on the more expensive imported fish that a wealthier, more ambitious dish might call for. Eels, too, deserve a moment of real attention because they occupied a genuinely important place in the English diet of this period in a way that might surprise anyone encountering this detail for the first time. Kept alive in special ponds until needed, then prepared in a range of ways. Stewed, roasted, worked into pies of their own, eels provided a reliable, genuinely well-regulated source of protein on the many days across the year when religious custom prohibited meat. A cook skilled in preparing them understood exactly how to manage their particular texture and flavor. And a well-made eel dish served at Elizabeth's table on a Friday evening might be received with just as much genuine pleasure as any meat dish offered earlier in the week. I think it is worth pausing on gently how much genuine skill and care went into food that modern audiences might now consider strange or even off-putting. Nothing about eels or oysters prepared thoughtfully by a skilled Tudor cook would have struck anyone at Elizabeth's table as unusual or unpleasant. This was simply good food prepared by people who understood their ingredients deeply, serving a household that expected genuine quality, regardless of what religious calendar happened to be shaping that particular day's menu. Let's spend a little time now with a quieter evening, one without ambassadors or grand occasion, just Elizabeth and a small handful of her closest ladies gathered together after a light supper, because I think this kind of ordinary, unremarkable moment deserves its place in tonight's story, too. The meal itself has already been cleared, the last of the wine poured, and the small group has settled into particular comfortable stillness that comes at the end of an ordinary day among people who know each other well. Someone has brought out an instrument, a lute perhaps, and plays quietly while the others listen, or occasionally join in with a few lines of song. This was, by many accounts, something Elizabeth genuinely enjoyed, music and quiet company. After the formal demands of the day had finally been set aside, and her ladies understood these evenings as some of the few genuinely relaxed hours available to a woman who spent most of her waking life performing one version or another of monarchy for an audience that never entirely stopped watching. A small dish of sweetmeats sits within easy reach, sugared almonds and candied fruit, and Elizabeth reaches for these occasionally throughout the evening, unhurried, genuinely enjoying in a way that carries none of the careful performance her public dining always demanded. Maybe she is the lady closest to her tonight, watching this small, unguarded pleasure with the same tender attentiveness we described earlier, understanding without needing to articulate it fully even to herself that evenings like this one represent something genuinely precious. A queen allowed briefly to simply be a woman enjoying good company and a little something sweet at the end of a long day. Let's talk a little about the hierarchy within the kitchen itself, because I realize we have spent so much time following individual dishes tonight that we have not properly explored how the people producing them related to one another. At the top of this particular world sat the master cook, a position of genuine authority and considerable skill, responsible not merely for cooking but for overseeing an entire staff of assistants, apprentices, and specialized workers, each handling their own particular corner of the kitchen's vast daily output. This was not a role handed out lightly. A master cook serving a royal household had typically spent decades building the reputation and skill necessary to earn this position, working up through years of apprenticeship, learning first the simplest tasks before gradually being trusted with more complex and consequential work. Beneath him, a whole structure of specialized roles existed. Cooks who focused specifically on roasting, others who managed the pastry work, others still responsible entirely for sauces and the careful, precise seasoning that could make or ruin an otherwise well-prepared dish. Apprentices, often quite young, moved through the structure gradually, started with the most menial tasks, fetching water, tending fires, cleaning, before slowly being permitted to handle actual food preparation, as their skill and trustworthiness became established over years of steady, patient work. A young apprentice starting out in this kitchen might spend her first months doing little more than scrubbing pots and carrying water, work that felt some days impossibly far removed from the elaborate dishes she had come here hoping to learn how to make. But this slow apprenticeship served a genuine purpose. A kitchen producing food for a monarch could not afford mistakes born from inexperience, and a careful, gradual structure of advancement ensured that by the time someone was finally trusted with a dish destined for Elizabeth's own table, they had already proven themselves reliable through years of smaller, less consequential tasks. I think there is something worth noticing in how much this mirrors the wider structure of the entire household we have explored tonight. The same careful, patient system of earning trust gradually, whether among the kitchen staff learning to cook or the ladies of the privy chamber learning to serve. Nothing in this world happened by accident, and nothing important was handed to anyone without years of demonstrated reliability behind it. Let's talk, too, about the dishes that did not succeed, because I think this deserves honest attention rather than being smoothed over in favor of only the triumphs. Not every dish prepared for Elizabeth's table landed the way the kitchen hoped it would. Taste shifted over the years, and a dish that had once been a genuine favorite might gradually fall out of favor, without any single dramatic moment marking the change. A cook noticing that a particular preparation had gone untouched 2 evenings in a row learned over time to read this as its own kind of quiet feedback and adjusted accordingly, removing that dish from rotation, trying a variation instead, watching carefully to see whether the change was better received. This process of quiet trial and adjustment happened constantly, invisibly across years of service. An entire unspoken conversation conducted through what returned from the table full and what came back scraped clean. Nobody ever set the head cook down and formally explained that a particular dish no longer pleased the queen. The dish simply gradually stopped appearing, replaced by something else that the kitchen's careful attention had identified as a better fit for her current preferences. Maybe she is a cook who takes this feedback with real professional seriousness, treating each returned dish not as a personal rejection, but as genuinely useful information, the same way any skilled crafts person learns in the result of their work. Over years, this accumulated attention built up into exactly the kind of intimate, unspoken knowledge of Elizabeth's preferences that we discussed earlier tonight. Knowledge held collectively by the kitchen and the ladies who serve or refined continuously through small daily observations that nobody bothered to write down because everybody who needed to know simply already knew. Let's step outside for a while into the gardens that supplied so much of what filled Elizabeth's table, because I do not think we have spent nearly enough time in this particular corner of the story tonight. Early morning in the kitchen gardens carried its own particular quiet, considerably different from the noise and heat we found in the kitchens themselves. Dew still clung to the leaves when the gardeners began their work, and the air smelled of turned earth and crushed herbs, sharp and green in a way that the smoky, spissel-laden kitchen air never quite matched. Rows of vegetables stretched across carefully maintained beds, tended with precision that reflected exactly how seriously the supply chain was taken, since a single poorly managed bed could mean a genuine gap in what the kitchen had available to work with. A gardener kneeling among the herbs this particular morning has worked this same plot for years and knows exactly which plants need attention today, which are ready for harvest, which still need another week of growth before they will be worth cutting. She moves methodically down the rows, gathering what the kitchen has requested for today's meals, sage and thyme, and particular variety of mint that Elizabeth's own household favored above the others, cutting each bundle with practiced efficiency before moving to the next. Beyond the herb beds, an orchard supplies the fruit that finds its way, eventually into so many of the dishes we have discussed tonight. The stewed pears Elizabeth favored so genuinely, the plums and cherries that flavored summer desserts, apples that would be stored carefully through autumn to help carry the household through, the leaner winter months we discussed earlier. The gardener responsible for this orchard understands the trees the way old friends understand each other, knowing which branches tend to bear the sweetest fruit, which trees need extra care after a difficult season, timing the harvest with precision built from years of careful, patient observation. I find something genuinely lovely in imagining this quiet, unglamorous morning work as the true beginning of everything we have followed tonight. Long before any fire was lit or any dish assembled, a pair that Elizabeth might barely notice reaching for during an ordinary supper began its journey, here months earlier, tended through an entire growing season by hand. She would never see and likely never think about in a garden she may have walked through herself on occasion, but rarely pause to truly examine. Let's talk briefly about the truly rare occasions, the exceptional feasts that call for genuinely unusual dishes beyond even what we explored during that Christmas season earlier tonight, because I think they deserve a moment of attention before we begin gently to close this story out. Swan, roasted and presented with particular ceremony, appear occasionally at the very grandest royal occasions. Its meat considerably less commonly eaten than the more familiar fowl that filled ordinary banquets, its presentation carrying a weight of tradition and exclusivity that few other dishes could match. Peacock, too, sometimes made an appearance at the most exceptional feasts, prepared with the same theatrical redressing in its own feathers that we discussed earlier regarding other birds. An extraordinary visual spectacle meant purely to astonish anyone fortunate enough to witness it. These dishes appeared rarely, reserved genuinely for the most exceptional occasions, and everyone involved in their preparation understood the weight of what they were creating. Something meant to be remembered, talked about, carried in letters and reports to courts across Europe as evidence of English splendor at its absolute peak. A cook entrusted with preparing swan for the royal table felt a particular kind of pressure that even the elaborate raised pie we discussed earlier could not quite match, aware that this dish would be discussed and remembered in a way that most of the daily work filling this story simply would not be. Music accompanied the grandest of these banquets almost without exception, and I think it is worth spending a little time with the musicians themselves, tucked usually into a gallery above the great hall, playing throughout the long procession of dishes we have described so many times tonight. A consort of musicians, skilled on instruments like the viol and the lute, provided a steady undercurrent of sound throughout an evening like this, their music calibrated carefully to the mood of the occasion, livelier during the early courses, softer and more contemplative as the evening wore on and the formal energy of the feast began to settle into something quieter. They watched the room below them constantly adjusting their pace and tone according to subtle cues, a shift in conversation, a particular dish's arrival, the Queen's own visible mood, without ever receiving explicit instruction to do so. One musician playing in this gallery on an ordinary grand feast night understood himself to be part of the same elaborate machinery of impression and comfort that filled every other corner of this story. His music working alongside the sugar sculptures and the careful seating arrangements and the elaborate procession of covered dishes to create a single unified experience of royal splendor. He rarely thought of his own contribution as separate from any of this. It was simply another thread woven into the same careful, deliberate abundance. And beneath the music, beneath the elaborate dishes, beneath even the careful diplomatic calculation we spent so much time with earlier tonight. Something genuinely human continued quietly along. Evening after evening, year after year. People eating together. People caring for one another through the simple universal act of preparing and sharing food. Whatever else this world was, however strange and hierarchical and performative it could be, it remained underneath all of that a story about people feeding people, the oldest and simplest kind of care there is. I want to tell you about one particular evening now, quieter than the grand feast we have spent so much time with, because I think it captures something true about the whole of what we have explored together tonight. It is late in Elizabeth's reign. An ordinary evening, nothing especially remarkable marking it out from 100 others like it. She sits at her private table, the one we visited together at the very start of tonight's story, surrounded by the same small circle of trusted ladies who have cared for her for so many years now. The meal tonight is simple, bread and a light dish of fish, since it happens to be a fasting day, followed by the stewed fruit that has remained across all these years and all these changes. A genuine and consistent comfort. Maybe she is the same lady we met earlier, considerably older herself now, her own hands perhaps a little less steady than they once were, though her attention to Elizabeth's needs has, if anything, only sharpened with decades' practice. She pours the wine cut with water, exactly as always, and watches Elizabeth reach unhurried for bread first. The same small ritual that has repeated itself, with only the smallest variations across the entire length of this remarkable reign. There is nothing dramatic in this particular evening, no ambassador to impress, no elaborate sugar sculpture, no grand hall full of watching courtiers, just a woman eating a simple meal, cared for by people who have known her intimately in their own particular way for the better part of their working lives. And I think honestly, this is the truest image this whole story has to offer. Truer even than the banquets and the diplomacy and elaborate theater of royal abundance. A quiet room, a small fire, good bread, people who care. However much power surrounded Elizabeth, however much history remembers her as a monarch shaping the fate of nations, this small ordinary comfort remained. Night after night, the thing that actually sustained her. Let's talk about the ideas that shaped how this entire world understood food in the first place, because Tudor England approached diet through a framework quite different from anything we would recognize now, and I think it deserves real attention before we continue. Physicians and educated households of this period generally understood the body according to a system inherited from ancient medicine built around the idea that different foods carry particular qualities, some considered hot, some cold, some moist, some dry, and that a person's health depended on keeping these qualities in appropriate balance according to their own individual constitution. A dish of stewed fruit sweetened with sugar might be considered warming and beneficial for someone whose constitution ran cold. Certain meats were considered heavier, more warming, better suited to winter than summer. This framework shaped not merely what appeared on Elizabeth's table, but how her physicians thought about adjusting her diet during illness. The choices we discussed earlier regarding thin broths and gentle, easily digested foods, reflecting exactly this kind of thinking about balance and restoration. A physician attending Elizabeth during a period of poor health would consult with the kitchen not merely about what might taste pleasant, but about what qualities a particular dish carried according to this inherited medical framework, adjusting her meals with the same seriousness a modern doctor might bring to a carefully calibrated dietary recommendation, though built on an entirely different understanding of how the body actually worked. This is worth remembering, I think, because it reminds us that the elaborate care surrounding Elizabeth's food was never purely about luxury or display. Genuine, careful thought about health and well-being ran through nearly every decision made about what she ate, even if the underlying science from our modern vantage point looks quite different from what we now understand to be true. Let's talk, too, about what happened when illness struck not the queen herself, but someone within this careful chain of people responsible for her food, because I think this reveals something further about how seriously the entire system was maintained. A taster who fell ill even from something as ordinary as a common seasonal cold created a genuine small crisis within the household's careful routine. Since his particular role could not simply be handed to anyone available, a replacement had to be someone already known, already trusted, already familiar with the responsibility, and households maintained quietly more than one person capable of stepping into this role precisely because illness or absence had to be planned for in a system that's dependent on consistent, reliable trust. Maybe he is a younger man, still building his own reputation within the household, called upon suddenly to step into this responsibility earlier than he might have expected, feeling particular weight of it more acutely than his older, more experienced colleague ever consciously noticed anymore after years of routine. He performs the role carefully, seriously, aware that this unexpected opportunity, however temporary, represents a genuine test of his own reliability, one that might shape how quickly he advances within a household's careful hierarchy in the years ahead. Let's move forward now into spring, because I want to complete the seasonal circle we began tracing earlier tonight before we finally settle into the closing hours of the story. Spring brought its own particular relief after the long stretch of winter's stored and preserved fare, the first truly fresh vegetables of the year finally arriving from the kitchen gardens, tender young greens at the entire household, from the queen down to the youngest kitchen apprentice, genuinely welcomed after months of root vegetables and salted meat. A cook working the early days of the season felt something close to genuine excitement handling the first fresh peas of the year, a small pleasure that repeated itself reliably every single spring across the entire length of Elizabeth's long reign, the natural rhythm of the seasons providing a kind of steady, comforting continuity beneath everything else that changed across those many years. Let's talk about linen for a while, because I mentioned earlier just how carefully it was maintained, and I think the actual process deserves more of our attention tonight. Keeping the fine white linen used at Elizabeth's own table in the condition her household demanded required considerable ongoing labor, entirely separate from anything happening in the kitchens we have spent so much time in tonight. Lundresses responsible for this particular work understood that the Queen's linen could never simply be washed the way ordinary household cloth was washed. It required repeated careful laundering, exposure to sunlight for bleaching, a whole slow process aimed at achieving and maintaining a whiteness that would look by candlelight at her table almost luminous. A laundress spreading fresh linen across a grassy area to bleach in the sun understood this work as its own quiet craft, watching the fabric carefully, turning it periodically, judging by long experience exactly how much sun exposure would achieve the desired result without damaging the delicate weave. This work happened continuously, cycling to the household's considerable stock of fine linen, ensuring that whatever cloth eventually made its way to Elizabeth's table always presented the same immaculate appearance, regardless of how recently it had actually been used. I find something worth noticing in how much invisible labor sat behind even the smallest details of Elizabeth's dining experience. That gleaming white cloth beneath her plate represented hours of careful work by someone she likely never thought about at all. In the same way most of us rarely think about the countless hands involved in producing the simplest comforts of our own daily lives. Let's talk too about how Elizabeth's food choices occasionally became the subject of quiet court conversation, because I think this reveals something about how closely observed every aspect of her life truly was. Even something as ordinary as what she chose to eat on a given evening, a courtier attending a public meal might notice, and later mention to a friend that the Queen had seemed to particularly favor a certain dish that evening, or had pushed something aside without explanation. And these small observations passed along to the informal gossip networks that ran beneath every royal court of this period, sometimes carried more weight than anyone involved might have expected. A foreign ambassador's report home might mention, in passing, some small detail about the Queen's appetite or apparent health drawn entirely from watching what she ate or did not eat during a single public dinner. And that small detail filtered through diplomatic correspondence could shape how an entire foreign court understood England's stability and the health of its aging monarch. This is worth sitting with, I think, because it means that even the smallest, most private-seeming choice, reaching for one dish rather than another, could ripple outward into genuine political consequence. Elizabeth understood this, of course, better than anyone, and it likely shaped, at least at her most public meals, exactly how carefully she managed even the smallest visible gestures of appetite or preference. The private table we visited at the start of tonight's story mattered, in part precisely because it offered one of the only spaces where this particular kind of scrutiny simply did not apply. Let's spend a little time on custards and tarts, because we have talked so much about meat and bread and sugar sculpture tonight that I think these gentler, simpler sweets deserve their own moment. A custard made from eggs and cream and sweetened carefully with sugar, flavored sometimes with a little of the rose water we encountered earlier, or with a pinch of nutmeg from that carefully guarded spicery, represented one of the gentler pleasures available to Elizabeth's table, considerably less theatrical than the elaborate marchpane creations we discussed earlier, but genuinely beloved for its own particular comfort. A cook preparing this dish worked carefully over gentle heat, aware that custard could curdle disastrously if rushed or handled carelessly, stirring with the kind of patient, unhurried attention that this particular dish demanded. Tarts, too, filled with fruit or with a sweetened custard base, offered another gentle sweetness that appeared regularly across Elizabeth's table. The pastry worked thin and delicate, quite different from the sturdy, freestanding pastry we discussed earlier in the context of the raised meat pie. A fruit tart filled with the same stewed pears or plums that appeared so often throughout tonight's story represented a genuinely simple pleasure, one that required real skill to execute well, but carried none of the elaborate theater that so much of Elizabeth's public dining demanded. I think these gentler dishes deserve real attention precisely because they remind us that not everything in this world was about spectacle. Some of it was simply about small, genuine comfort, a spoonful of custard enjoyed quietly at the end of a long day, requiring nothing more complicated of the person eating it than the simple pleasure of good food carefully made. Let's talk honestly for a moment about the evening when something actually went wrong, because I think a story built entirely around smooth, flawless service would not be telling you the whole truth of what this world was actually like. On one particular evening, years into the story we've been following, a dish arrived at Elizabeth's private table slightly overcooked, the meat inside a pie, having spent too long in an oven that had run somewhat hotter than intended. Nobody noticed until the pie was cut open, the filling drier than it should have been, and the lady serving that evening felt a small, sharp moment of genuine alarm, aware that this mistake, however minor, reflected on the entire kitchen's competence. Elizabeth, according to the small handful of details that survive from moments like this, scattered across various household accounts, generally responded to such minor mistakes with considerably more grace than her reputation for occasional sharp temper might suggest, at least within the privacy of her own rooms among trusted servants. A slightly overcooked pie, quietly set aside in favor of another dish, rarely became the dramatic confrontation that popular imagination might expect. The lady serving that evening breathed a private sigh of relief, made a mental note to mention the oven's temperature to the kitchen the following morning, and the evening continued largely undisturbed. I find this small, quiet, undramatic moment somehow more revealing than any of the grand banquets we spent time with earlier tonight. Mistakes happen inevitably in a system this complex and dependent on so many separate hands working in coordination. What mattered was not the absence of mistakes, but the practiced quiet grace with which this world absorbed them, correcting course gently, without drama, and moving forward into the next meal, the next day, the next season, exactly as it always had. Let's take a step back now and consider the sheer scale of all this, because I think putting real numbers to it spoken out gently rather than dropped as dry statistics helps make the size of this world genuinely tangible. A royal household of this size and status might employ across every department we have wandered through tonight, kitchens and cellars and gardens and laundry, and the wider staff of ladies and gentlemen attending the Queen directly, several hundred people at any given time, a number that could grow considerably larger still whenever court traveled or hosted a particularly grand occasion. Feeding a household this size every single day for years on end represented an ongoing logistical undertaking on a scale that few institutions anywhere in England could match. Consider for a moment just the bread alone. A household this size, consuming bread at every single meal across an entire day, required loaves baked by the dozens, sometimes considerably more, every single morning, without exception, for the entire length of Elizabeth's decades-long reign. Multiply that single detail across meat, fish, ale, wine, vegetables, spice, sugar, and every other ingredient we have discussed tonight, and the true scale of what this household consumed across even a single ordinary week becomes almost difficult to hold in the mind all at once. And at the very center of this entire vast humming machine sat one woman, eating, by most accounts, remarkably little of what was actually produced around her. I keep returning to this particular detail tonight because I think it captures something genuinely essential about the nature of monarchy itself in this period. Power did not express itself through personal consumption, not primarily. It expressed itself through the capacity to command this kind of vast coordinated abundance, whether or not any single person actually needed or even wanted the greater part of what was produced. I find myself thinking honestly about how strange and how human this whole arrangement really was. An entire kingdom's resources in some meaningful sense, organized around feeding a woman who mostly just wanted bread, a little stewed fruit, and a cup of wine cut generously with water. Everything else, the sugar sculptures, the elaborate pies, the swan and the peacock, and the towering displays of banquet theater, existed not for her private appetite, but for the world watching her, for the story England needed to tell about itself through food, to anyone paying attention. Let's slow down now gently, because I think we are approaching a part of the night where the story itself wants to rest. Come back with me one more time to that small private table where we began this whole journey together tonight, because I want to sit there with you a little longer before we finally let this story close. Picture it again, the fine linen glowing faintly in candlelight, the single knife resting near Elizabeth's hand, the silver cup catching small points of flame each time it moves. The lady standing nearby has done this so many times now that her movements carry the particular grace of long practice, unhurried, exact, anticipating each small need before it needs to be spoken. Outside these rooms, the vast machinery we have spent tonight exploring continues turning. Kitchens and cellars and gardens, andries, hundreds of hands working in careful coordination, all of it converging quietly toward this one small room, and this one modest meal. The bread tonight is warm, the crust giving softly under gentle pressure, and Elizabeth breaks a piece from it, the same way she has done 10,000 times before across the length of her long reign. The stewed pears, when they arrive, carry that particular fragrance of cinnamon and sugar that we traced all the way back to a small locked room off the kitchen, where a woman, with a careful hand and a careful ledger, measured out exactly enough spice for this one modest dish among the dozens prepared. Today, I want you to notice one last time everything that had to happen for this single ordinary moment to exist. A gardener tending pear trees months earlier, a merchant carrying spice across an ocean, a confectioner working sugar into shape, a taster quietly, invisibly ensuring safety with a single spoonful and a single patient pause, a laundress bleaching linen in the sun, a lady learning over years exactly how her queen prefers her wine poured. None of them are in this room tonight, and yet all of them in some real sense are present in this single quiet meal, their careful work folded invisibly into the warm bread and the sweet fruit and the soft candle light. This is what I find myself thinking about most honestly when I sit with this whole story. How much invisible care can gather itself into one small, ordinary moment. How many hands? How much patience? How much accumulated skill, all quietly converging towards something as simple as a woman eating her dinner in peace. Let the fire in that room burn low now the way fires always eventually do, and let the evening settle further into itself, the conversation growing quieter, the candles beginning their own slow, unhurried journey toward morning, long after Elizabeth herself had finished eating and retired for the evening. A particular kind of work continued quietly in the rooms just beyond her own, work that almost nobody beyond the household itself ever thought to consider. The dishes from her private table had to be cleared, of course, carried back down through the same guarded corridors we walked earlier tonight. the covered trays now empty or holding whatever remained uneaten. In a scullery tucked away near the main kitchen, a small crew of servants, considerably lower in the household's careful hierarchy than the ladies who had served the meal directly, scrubbed plates and cups, and the single knife Elizabeth had used, working by candlelight. Long after most of the rest of the palace had gone quiet, this was unglamorous, physically demanding work. Hands roar from hot water and rough soap, and it happened every single night without exception, regardless of how grand or how ordinary the meal had been. A young woman responsible for this particular task tonight has been at it since before Elizabeth even sat down to eat, and will likely still be at it for another hour or more, before she can finally seek her own bed, exhausted in a particular way that comes from a long day of physical labor, rather than a more visible, more celebrated labor of the cooks and ladies whose work we spent so much time with earlier tonight. I think she deserves a place in this story, too. Honestly, every bit as much as a confectioner shaping sugar into castles, or the lady pouring wine with practiced grace. Her work is less visible, rarely mentioned in any surviving account, and entirely necessary. Without her patient scrubbing, tomorrow's breakfast could not be served on clean plate. Without her quiet, unglamorous labor at the very end of each long day, none of the elegance and ceremony we have followed through so much of tonight's story could actually function night after night for years on end. She works alone, mostly in the deep, quiet hours after the rest of the household is settled, and there is something almost meditative in the repetition of it. The same motions, the same careful attention, the same slow satisfaction of watching a dirty plate come clean under her hands. She does not think of herself as important particularly, but the whole elaborate machinery we have explored together tonight. Every single piece of it depends entirely on people like her doing the same quiet work every single night, whether anyone above stairs ever thinks to notice or not. Let's drift for a while through the palace one final time tonight, slowly, without hurrying toward any particular destination, the way you might wander through a familiar house late at night, when everyone else is already asleep. The great hall, so full of light and music and careful ceremony during the banquets we visited earlier, sits now in near total darkness, its long tables bare, its tapestries barely visible, except where a stray beam of moonlight happens to catch their woven surface. It is strange how completely a room can change character, depending on whether it holds people or not. The same stone walls that rang with music and conversation during that ambassador's visit now hold only silence, and the particular kind of stillness that settles into grand rooms once everyone is finally gone. Down in the kitchens, the last embers glow faintly in the great hearth where we watched that spit of beef turning so many hours ago, tended down almost nothing now by the single servant whose quiet job it is to keep them just barely alive until morning. The smell of the day's cooking still lingers faintly in the air, with smoke and roasted meat and something sweeter underneath, the ghost of sugar work from earlier in the day, slowly fading as the night wears on. The spicery sits locked, its careful keeper long since gone to her own rest, the cinnamon and nutmeg and precious black pepper waiting quietly in the dark for tomorrow's work to begin again. The cellars, cool and still, hold their rows of wine and their jars of preserved fruit in complete darkness, undisturbed until someone returns with a lamp in the early hours ahead. Even the gardens outside sit quiet under whatever moon or clouds happen to be passing overhead tonight. The pear trees and herb beds resting through the dark hours before the gardener returns, as she does every single morning to begin the whole patient cycle over again. And somewhere in her own private rooms, Elizabeth sleeps or tries to, the particular weight of ruling a kingdom set down for a few hours at least, her lady keeping her quiet watch nearby, exactly as we described earlier tonight. Tomorrow the ovens will be lit again before dawn. Tomorrow the whole vast, careful machinery of feeding a queen will begin turning once more, exactly as it is every single day for years, exactly as it will continue for years still to come. There is something genuinely comforting in that rhythm. I think the sheer reliability of it, the way this entire world simply continued day after day, season after season, regardless of whatever larger dramas of politics and power happen to be unfolding around it. Bread would be baked, Fires would be lit. Someone would taste the food before the queen did. Someone would pour her wine exactly the way she liked it. The world, in its smallest and most human details, kept turning. I think if you have stayed with me this long tonight, you have probably noticed something about how many different people we have met along the way. A baker shaping bread before dawn. A woman measuring spice with careful precision. A taster pausing over a spoonful of pottage. A confectioner working sugar into the shape of a castle. A lady learning slowly the 1,000 small rules of court. A gardener kneeling in dew-damp herbs. A scullery maid scrubbing plates long after everyone else has gone to bed. None of these people knew each other's full stories. Probably each of them experienced only their own small corner of this vast coordinated effort, their own particular tasks, their own particular relationship with the food that eventually through so many careful hands reached Elizabeth's table. And yet together, without ever quite realizing the scale of what they were collectively building, they created something remarkable, an entire quiet world organized around the daily care and comfort of one woman who carried every single day the weight of an entire kingdom on her shoulders. Maybe you recognize something of yourself in one of them tonight. Maybe you're the kind of person who takes quiet pride in work that mostly goes unnoticed the way that scullery maid did, finding a strange comfort in repetitive careful labor at the end of a long day. Maybe you are someone who has learned over years to read the people around you the way that lady learned to read Elizabeth, anticipating needs before they are spoken, finding meaning in small acts of care that nobody ever formally thanks you for. Maybe you simply love the quiet satisfaction of a task done well, the way that baker felt shaping dough his hands had shaped 10,000 times before, finding something almost meditative in the familiar motion of it. Whoever you recognize yourself in tonight, I hope you carry a little of their patience with you as you drift off. This whole story in the end is really just about ordinary people doing ordinary work extraordinary well night after night for years on end, mostly without ever being thanked or even noticed. There's something worth honoring in that, I think, something worth carrying with you into your own rest of night. Let's slow down even further now, because I can feel the night settling in around both of us, and I think it is time to let this particular evening finally close. Actually, before we let the evening close completely, I want to share one more thing with you because it comes from an account left behind by an actual visitor to Elizabeth's court, and I think it deserves a place here rather than being left out simply because we are approaching the end of tonight's story. A traveler from the German lands, visiting England during Elizabeth's reign, and later writing down his impressions of what he witnessed, described in some detail the elaborate ceremony surrounding the laying of the Queen's table, a ritual conducted with considerable formality, even apparently on occasions when Elizabeth herself was not present in the room to witness it directly. Servants bowed, knelt, and moved through the tasting and serving ritual we have spent so much time with tonight, with a solemnity that struck this particular foreign observer as genuinely remarkable, worth recording carefully for readers back in his own country, who would likely never witness anything quite like it themselves. This kind of first-hand account matters, I think, because it confirms something that might otherwise sound almost too elaborate to be believed, that the ceremony surrounding Elizabeth's food was not simply a story historians later embellished for effect, but a genuine documented practice witnessed and recorded by someone with no particular reason to exaggerate what he saw. It is worth distinguishing honestly between details like this grounded in an actual eyewitness account and some of the more colorful legends that gathered around Elizabeth over the centuries since her death. Stories about her diet or her habits that later writers sometimes embellished considerably beyond what any contemporary source actually supports. Tonight, I have tried to keep us mostly in the territory of what genuinely documented evidence and reasonable historical reconstruction can support, occasionally noting where we are stepping into more speculative territory, because I think the real story carefully told is compelling enough without needing embellishment. What this traveler witnessed, that careful bowing and kneeling, even before an empty chair, captures something we have circled around all night without quite naming it directly. The ceremony surrounding Elizabeth's food was never really about the food at all. It was about power made visible through ritual, performed so consistently and so thoroughly that it continued even in her physical absence. a kind of muscle memory built into the very architecture of how this household understood itself and its purpose. And yet, underneath all of that formal ceremony, we have spent tonight discovering something gentler, too. The quiet, genuine care that so many of these same servants brought to their work, the real warmth that existed alongside the formality, the small human moments, a lady's tenderness, a cook's pride, a gardener's patient attention that no amount of ceremony could ever fully replace or explain away. Let's go back one more time to palace gates because I mentioned the almond's traditional role earlier tonight, only briefly, and I think this particular thread deserves a fuller telling before we finally close each morning, and particularly following the grandest occasions we have spent so much time with tonight. A gathering of the genuinely poor assembled near the palace gates, hoping for whatever surplus the household chose to distribute. This practice, rooted in older English customs stretching back considerably further than Elizabeth's own reign, positioned charitable distribution of leftover food as a genuine, if modest, obligation attached to great households, a way of extending at least some small portion of royal abundance outward to those who would otherwise never taste anything close to it. An hour responsible for this distribution, on an ordinary morning, worked from whatever surplus the kitchen had genuinely produced bread that had gone slightly stale portions of meat and pie left over from the previous evening's dinner. Occasionally something considerably finer, if a banquet the night before had produced more elaborate leftovers than the household itself could use. He distributed this with certain careful order, aware that too little organization could produce genuine chaos among a crowd desperate enough to have gathered here in the first place, and aware, too, that how this distribution was conducted reflected in its own small way on the Queen's reputation for charity and care toward her poorest subjects. Maybe she is a woman standing in that gathered crowd this particular morning, having walked some genuine distance to the chance at whatever bread or meat might be distributed today, holding a basket that she hopes by the time she leaves will carry enough to help feed her own family for at least another day or two. She has stood in this same spot more mornings than she could easily count, and understands better than almost anyone we have met tonight the true weight of the gap between abundance and scarcity that has run underneath this entire story from the very beginning. I think it is important, honestly, that we end our exploration of food and scarcity, with her rather than without her. Everything we have, discussed tonight, the sugar sculptures, the elaborate banquets, the careful ceremony surrounding even a queen's most private meal, existed within a wider world, where genuine hunger remained an ordinary daily reality for a great many of Elizabeth's subjects. The distance between her table and this woman's basket was enormous, and no amount of careful almsgiving at the palace gate could fully close it, but it existed. This small gesture, this modest bridge between two entirely different experiences of the same kingdom. And I think it deserves acknowledgement, rather than being left out of a story that has otherwise spent so much time with abundance. Let's spend a little time with hunting before we finally settle into the closing hours of tonight's story. Because the sport itself connected directly to a great deal of what filled Elizabeth's table across the years, and I think it deserves its own moment tonight. Elizabeth genuinely enjoyed hunting by most surviving accounts, and continued riding out with her court well into years, when many might have expected a monarch of her age and status to set such vigorous activity aside. A successful hunt produced venison that will within hours begin its own journey through the same elaborate kitchen machinery we have followed all night, hung briefly to develop flavor, according to practices of the period, then eventually worked into the roasted dishes, or the raised pies we spent time with earlier appearing at her table, with a particular kind of pride attached, since this meat had not simply been purchased or delivered, but represented in some small way the Queen's own physical vigor and skill. A huntsman responsible for managing these expeditions understood his work as connecting directly to everything we have explored tonight. The fields and forests surrounding a royal estate feeding just as surely into Elizabeth's table as the kitchen gardens and orchards we visited earlier, though through an entirely different kind of labor, considerably more physical, considerably more dependent on skill, patience, and genuine knowledge of the land and the animals living within it. I find something worth noticing in how this particular thread connects Elizabeth's own physical body, riding hard across open country, directly to the food that eventually reached her private table. Most of what we have explored tonight involve her as a distant, almost passive recipient of enormous collective effort. Hunting offered something different, a moment where she participated actively in producing at least some small part of what would eventually be prepared and served in her name, and those who rode alongside her on these occasions witnessed a version of the Queen considerably more physical, more vigorous, more visibly alive than the careful, composed figure presiding over grand banquets. Now, gently, let us finally let the evening close, because I think we'll walk together through nearly every corner of this remarkable world, and the night itself is growing late. Let me walk you through it all once more, slowly now, one final time, the way you might flip back to a familiar book before finally setting it down for the night. Somewhere right now in the version of this world we have spent tonight inside, the ovens are being lit again hours before dawn. The same patient ritual repeating itself exactly as it has every single morning for years. A baker's hands find their way through the same familiar motions, folding dough that will become manchet bread pale enough for a queen's table and coarser loaves for everyone standing below her in this careful, ordered world. The fire catches slowly, then steadily, filling the room with that particular warmth that has nothing to do with the season outside and everything to do with the enormous patient work of feeding hundreds of people every single day without fail. In the spicery, that small locked room holding wealth measured out grain by careful grain, someone unlocks the door and steps inside, breathing in that dense, warm smell of cinnamon and clove and precious black pepper, well from across the entire known world, gathered into one small chamber tucked away in an English palace. She measures what the day requires, no more, careful as always, because nothing in this room is ever wasted or handled carelessly. Down in the cellars, cool and dim even as the summer sun begins climbing outside, the wine rests undisturbed in its careful rows, and somewhere among preserved fruit, a jar of candied orange peel sits waiting for an evening when someone decides a queen might enjoy something bright and unexpected after a long day. The ale brewed steadily and reliably fills casks that will keep an entire household moving through their long working hours. Fuel for hundreds of hands doing hundreds of different tasks, all of it converging eventually toward the same small private table we have returned to so many times tonight. Outside in gardens still damp with morning dew, a gardener kneels among rows of herbs and vegetables, cutting exactly what today's kitchen requires. No more her hands moving with the easy confidence of someone who has done the same work for years, who knows these particular plants the way you might know an old and steady friend. Beyond her in the orchard, pear trees hold fruit that will in a matter of weeks become the stewed pears that Elizabeth reaches for with such genuine, unguarded pleasure. A small thread of comfort running consistently through the entire length of this remarkable reign. Somewhere else in the palace, a taster stands quietly near a restricted doorway, ready to perform the same small essential gesture he has performed thousands of times before. A spoonful, a pause, a nod. The invisible architecture of trust that makes everything else in the story possible. And somewhere near him, a gentleman usher checks his own appearance one final time before the day's formal service begins, understanding, as he always has, that his own bearing matters as much to this world's careful theater as any dish the kitchen produces. By midday, the great procession begins. Dishes carried, through guarded corridors, covered carefully, watched at every stage, until finally, at the very end of this long, patient chain, they reach a small private room, where fine linen glows softly by candlelight, and a queen sits down to eat considerably less than anyone watching might expect. Bread first, usually, then whatever meat or fish the calendar happens to call for today. Then, if the kitchen has done its work well, something sweet, something that makes her reach with genuine visible pleasure, rather than the careful practice grace her public meals always demand. And through it all, quietly, invisibly, hundreds of other lives continue their own separate threads through the same enormous story. A confectioner shaping sugar into something meant to astonish. A lady learning slowly the thousand unspoken rules that govern this world. Aldrich bleaching linen white beneath an open sky. A scullery made later in the deep, quiet hours of night, scrubbing plates clean by candlelight, long after everyone else has gone to rest. An almoner distributing whatever surplus the previous evening produced to a crowd of genuinely hungry people gathered patiently at the palace gates. None of them know the full shape of the story they are collectively building. Each of them experiences only their own small corner of it, their own particular tasks, their own particular relationship with the food that moves through so many careful hands toward a queen who rules the most powerful kingdom in the world, and still in her own quiet way, simply wants her dinner warm and her wine cut properly with water and a little something sweet at the end of a long, demanding day. As the afternoon wears on, the great hall begins its own separate preparation for whatever the evening might require, whether a grand banquet full of watching courtiers and careful diplomatic theater, or simply the quiet continuation of an ordinary day. Another supper, another modest meal shared among a small circle of trusted women in a room warmed by a low, steady fire. If tonight happens to be a night for spectacle, the kitchens shift into an entirely different register, the one we witnessed during that ambassador's visit earlier. Everyone moving with heightened purpose, the confectioner working with particular focus on something ambitious enough to impress a foreign visitor, the gentleman ushers reviewing one final time, the careful order in which tonight's elaborate procession of dishes will unfold. Musicians take their places in the gallery above the hall, tuning their instruments quietly, watching the room below them fill gradually with courtiers dressed in their own careful performance of wealth and status. Should tonight be simply an ordinary evening, the mood settles differently, gentler, quieter. The kind of evening we watched unfold earlier with music and sweetmeats and genuine, unguarded laughter among women who have known each other for years. Either way, the same careful machinery underlies everything, the same tasting rituals, the same guarded corridors, the same accumulated skill and labor converging toward whatever form tonight's meal happens to take. And either way, eventually the evening winds down toward its natural close. Dishes are cleared, linen is gathered for tomorrow's washing. The last of the wine is poured or set aside, depending on how the evening has unfolded. Elizabeth retires to her private rooms, a lady settling nearby for whatever quiet watch the night might require, and slowly, gradually, the vast humming machinery we have spent tonight exploring begins winding down toward its own daily rest. The fires bank low, but never quite extinguished. The spicery locked again until morning. The cellars settling into their own cool, undisturbed darkness. The gardens resting under whatever sky happens to be stretched above them tonight. And somewhere in a scullery tucked away from the grander rooms we have visited, a young woman finishes her own long night's work, scrubbing the last plate clean, setting it carefully to dry, finally allowed herself to think about her own bed, her own rest, after days spent almost entirely in service of someone else's comfort. This is the shape of an ordinary day in Elizabeth's world, repeated with only small variations across the entire length of her extraordinary reign. Abundance and restraint, ceremony and genuine warmth, enormous collective effort converging again and again toward small ordinary human comforts, bread and wine, and something sweet shared quietly among people who had learned over years of careful attention exactly how to care for one another within the particular constraint of the world they had all in their own different ways been born into. Let me tell you about the dairy briefly before we finally let this story rest. Because milk and butter and cream ran quietly through nearly everything we discussed tonight, without ever quite getting their own proper attention. A dairy maid working within the royal household supply chain rose early, as everyone in this story seems to, tending cows kept specifically to supply the palace with fresh milk, cream, and butter, none of which would be stored for any real length of time in a period without refrigeration, and all which needed to be used quickly within days. Before spoilage set in, butter churned by hand through slow, repetitive labor, found its way into pastry, into sauces, into the custards we discussed earlier, its quality depending entirely on the careful, unglamorous daily work of women whose names, like so many others in the story, rarely survive in any written record. Cream, too, played its own quiet role, folded into custards and possets, That particular warm drink of curdled milk and wine we visited earlier tonight, offered to Elizabeth on evenings when sleep seemed reluctant to arrive easily, a dairymaid churning butter in the cool early morning hours, understood her work as entirely separate from the grander spectacle of sugar sculpture and elaborate banquet theater, and yet equally essential since none of that finer work could happen without the steady, reliable foundation her own labor provided. I think there is something worth honoring one final time tonight in just how many separate threads of quiet, patient labor had to weave together to produce even the simplest comfort we have followed throughout this entire story. Butter on warm bread, cream in a gentle custard, milk curdled softly with wine on a difficult night. None of it grand, all of it essential, all of it built from hands that worked steadily, faithfully day after day, for a queen who likely never once thought to wonder where her butter actually came from. Let's finally, gently, let this whole vast, patient world settle into its own rest tonight. The last candle in Elizabeth's private chamber burns low now, its flame small and steady, casting soft shadows across walls hung with tapestries that watched over countless evenings just like this one. Decades of quiet suppers and quiet conversations folded invisibly into their woven threads. Her lady sits nearby, quiet, attentive, exactly as she has for so many years now, listening for the steady rhythm of breathing that means genuine sleep has finally arrived. Outside, the palace holds its own particular nighttime stillness, fires bank low, cellars locked, gardens resting under whatever stars happen to be visible tonight through England's changeable summer sky. The whole vast household finally quietly allowing itself to rest alongside her. I want to leave you before we finally close with one last image because I think it captures everything we have spent tonight exploring together better than any single fact or figure could picture Elizabeth one final time at that small private table. The fine linen glowing faintly beneath her, a modest fire warming the room, despite the summer evening outside. She has finished her meal now, mostly the bread eaten, the stewed pears reduced to nothing but a faint trace of cinnamon lingering in the air. A lady clears the last of the dishes quietly, careful not to disturb whatever quiet thoughts might be moving behind the queen's composed familiar expression, and for just a moment, before the evening's remaining small rituals begin, before the candles are checked and the fire banked, and the room finally settles into whatever version of rest a monarch's private chamber actually allows, Elizabeth simply sits still, unhurried, in a room built entirely around her comfort, by hundreds of hands she will mostly never think to name. A gardener's careful pears, a confectioner's precious sugar, a taster's quiet vigilance, a lairess's patient bleaching, all of it gathered invisibly into this one small, ordinary moment of a woman resting briefly at the end of a long and demanding day. This is what I hope you carry with you tonight, as you finally let yourself drift toward your own rest. Not the grand banquets, though they were genuinely remarkable in their own theatrical way. Not the elaborate sugar castles, or the swan dress in its own feathers, or the careful diplomatic calculation woven through every course of a state dinner. Something smaller than that, something gentler. The quiet accumulated care of hundreds of ordinary people working steadily, patiently, mostly without recognition, to make sure one woman, however powerful, however burdened, could sit down at the end of her day and simply eat her dinner in something close to peace. Maybe you recognize a little of that same quiet, accumulated care in your own life tonight. The people who have shown up for you in small, unglamorous ways over the years. The ones who learned exactly how you like things done without ever needing to be asked twice. Maybe you are one of those people yourself, offering that same quiet, patient care to someone else, mostly without recognition, mostly without ever expecting to be thanked. If so, I hope tonight's story has offered you some small comfort, some quiet acknowledgement that this kind of care, however invisible it might feel some days, genuinely matters, genuinely builds something worth having one small ordinary act at a time. The candle in that small private chamber has nearly burned down now. The lady keeping watch has settled into her own quiet stillness, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, England sleeps too. Ordinary people in ordinary homes, their own small comforts gathered around them in whatever modest way their own lives allow, connected in some distant sense to the very same rhythms of season and harvest and careful daily labor that filled a queen's table so many centuries ago. Let me tell you about one more occasion before we finally let tonight's story rest, because it recurred every single year of Elizabeth's reign and deserves its own place here. Each November, the anniversary of Elizabeth's accession to the throne was marked with genuine celebration across the kingdom, a day that grew across the decades of her reign into something close to a national holiday, complete with tournaments, church services, and naturally considerable feasting at court. This occasion carried a different emotional weight than the ambassador's visit we spent so much time with earlier tonight. Less about impressing a foreign observer, and more about genuine widespread celebration of Elizabeth's continued rule, a rule that had by the later decades of her reign come to feel to many of her subjects like a permanent and stabilizing fixture of English life. The kitchens preparing for this particular celebration approached it with a slightly different energy than even the grandest ambassador's banquet, closer perhaps to the warmth of Christmas that we explored earlier tonight than to the careful diplomatic calculation of a state visit. Dishes were chosen not primarily to impress a watching foreign eye, but to genuinely celebrate, and the household's own affection for the queen, built up across years of shared service, found its way into particular care taken with this occasion each year. A cook preparing for the celebration, having worked in the royal kitchens long enough to remember many previous Accession Day feasts, felt something close to genuine pride each November, aware that this occasion represented not merely another demonstration of wealth and power, but a real, if quiet, form of affection, an entire kingdom pausing to mark and celebrate the continued stability that Elizabeth's long reign had provided. The elaborate dishes prepared for this day carried in their own way a warmth that even the finest ambassador's banquet could not quite match. Born from genuine gratitude rather than purely diplomatic calculation, I find something quietly moving in imagining Elizabeth year after year receiving this particular kind of celebration, watching her own household and her wider kingdom mark with real warmth the simple fact of her continued presence on the throne. However isolating the enormous ceremony and careful protection surrounding her daily life might have been, however little true privacy she ever genuinely enjoyed, moments like this offered something different, a reminder that an entire kingdom had in its own complicated way come to genuinely value and even love the woman who had led them for so long. Let me tell you about one more small, ordinary thing before we finally close, because I think it deserves a place here, tucked among everything grander we have explored tonight. Elizabeth kept, according to accounts left behind by those who observed her household closely, a genuine fondness for certain fruits beyond the stewed pears we have returned to so many times tonight, and cherries, in particular, seemed to have held a special place among her private preferences during the height of their brief summer season. A gardener tending the cherry trees on a royal estate understood the narrow window this fruit demanded, ripening quickly, spoiling almost as fast, requiring the kind of careful daily attention that few other crops in this story quite matched. A basket of freshly picked cherries carried into the kitchen, still warm from the summer sun, might be served simply, unadorned, allowed to speak for themselves the way the finest, freshest ingredients often did, even amid a world so devoted to elaborate presentation and careful spicing. There was a particular pleasure those who serve her closely seemed to understand in offering Elizabeth something this direct, this uncomplicated, after so many meals built around careful theater and diplomatic calculation. A bowl of cherries required no confectioner's elaborate skill, no hours of preparation, simply the patient work of a gardener who attended the trees correctly and picked the fruit at exactly the right moment. I think there is something worth sitting with in this particular detail. One final small thread among so many we have followed tonight. Even within a world built so thoroughly around spectacle and careful ceremony, the simplest pleasures, a handful of ripe cherries eaten quietly at the end of a long day, still held genuine power to delight. Perhaps especially there, precisely because everything else in her daily life carried such weight of performance and calculation. A cherry asked nothing of her. It required no diplomatic response, No careful management of appearance. No consideration of how accepting or declining it might be read by watching eyes. It was simply sweet, simply fresh, simply hers to enjoy exactly as she pleased. Maybe this is worth remembering, as we finally let this whole long story settle toward its close tonight. However elaborate and ceremonial a life becomes, however many careful hands and careful rituals surround even the smallest daily moments, there remains almost always some small pocket of genuine, simple pleasure that no amount of ceremony can fully claim or complicate. A bowl of cherries, a piece of warm bread, a cup of wine cut exactly the way you like it. Small, ordinary, entirely genuine comforts tucked quietly into corners of even the grandest and most watched life imaginable. There's one more corner of this story I want to walk you through before we finally close tonight, and it concerns a particular relationship between Elizabeth's court and the wider city of London, because so much of what filled her table began its journey not in royal gardens or royal cellars, but in the ordinary crowded markets of the city itself. Certain suppliers held what amounted to something close to royal contracts, formal or informal arrangements that designated them as trusted providers of specific goods for the royal household, a genuine honor that also carried genuine responsibility. A fishmonger holding such an arrangement, the same man we met earlier delivering oysters fresh from the coast, understood that his entire livelihood depended on maintaining a reputation for absolute reliability, since a single delivery of substandard fish could cost him not merely this particular sale, but the entire ongoing relationship that had likely taken years to establish and would take considerably longer to rebuild if lost. Early each morning, before most of London had properly woken, these trusted suppliers made their way toward the palace, carts and baskets loaded with whatever the day's deliveries required, moving through streets that were at this hour still relatively quiet before the wider city's own daily commerce began in earnest. There was a particular kind of pride in this work, too, walking or riding these familiar routes toward the palace gates, understanding that whatever you carried might eventually, through all the careful hands and careful preparation we have followed tonight, end up on the Queen's own table, a cheesemonger, a butcher, a vintner, a spice merchant. Each maintained their own particular relationship with the royal household, their own particular reputation staked on consistent quality, and together they formed an entire invisible network stretching out from the palace into the wider commercial life of London itself, connecting Elizabeth's private table in ways she likely never consciously considered to the ordinary working lives of merchants and trades, people across the city. I think this connection matters honestly because it reminds us that the elaborate world we have spent tonight exploring never existed in true isolation. Every thread we have followed, the bread, the spice, the sugar, the wine, the fish, eventually traces back to some ordinary working person's daily labor. Someone rising early, working hard, building a reputation carefully over years, hoping to provide reliably for a household that in turn depended on their steady, trustworthy work, far more than either side probably paused very often to acknowledge. And so, as we finally let this whole vast, patient, interconnected world settle into its own rest tonight, I want you to picture it one final time in its entirety. Not simply Elizabeth at her table, though we return her there so often tonight, because she sits quite literally at the center of everything we have explored, but the whole enormous web extending outward from that small private room. Gardeners and fishmongers and confectioners and ladies and tasters and laresses and scullery maids and merchants moving through London's quiet early morning streets, all of them connected invisibly through the simple, universal, endlessly human act of feeding another person with care. Let me offer you one final thread tonight because I think it ties together something we touched on earlier without ever quite finishing the thought, and I want to give it proper space before we let the story rest. We talked much earlier tonight about the gap between the enormous quantities of food prepared each day and the comparatively modest amount Elizabeth herself actually consumed. And I want to return to that gap one last time, because I think it holds something genuinely important about how this entire world understood the relationship between power and appetite. A monarch's restraint, oddly enough, could function as its own quiet display of authority, the ability to sit before overwhelming abundance and simply not need it. to reach for bread and stewed fruit while elaborate dishes sat largely untouched nearby, communicated something that pure indulgence never could: control, discipline, a body that answered to the will of the mind governing it, rather than the reverse. This stood in quiet, unspoken contrast to certain other courts across Europe during the same period, where excess and visible indulgence sometimes served as the primary language of royal display. Elizabeth's own approach, restrained and private, even while presiding over spectacular abundance in public, offered her household and her wider court a particular kind of lesson absorbed gradually over years, rather than ever explicitly taught. Power did not require consumption. It required command, the capacity to summon abundance at will, whether or not you personally needed or even wanted a greater part of what your command produced. A lady who had served Elizabeth for decades by the later years of the story understood this lesson thoroughly, though she likely never articulated it in quite these terms, even to herself. She simply knew from long practical experience that offering the queen too much or pressing her to eat more than she genuinely wanted would never be received well. Elizabeth's appetite, modest and consistent across so many years, was not a problem to be solved or a preference to be overridden. It was simply part of who she was, respected and accommodated exactly as thoroughly as everything else about her that this careful household had learned patiently to understand. I find myself sitting with this thought as tonight's story finally winds toward its close, genuinely moved by how much quiet respect lived inside that accommodation, an entire household capable of producing dishes elaborate enough to astonish visiting ambassadors, choosing instead, night after night, in the privacy of her own rooms, to simply offer Elizabeth exactly what she actually wanted, not the grandest version of hospitality, the truest one, before that final memory. Let me give you one more small piece of this world, because I think it rounds out something we have circled around all night without quite finishing. We have spent so much of tonight following food forward from garden and market, and cellar through kitchen and corridor toward the Queen's own table. But I want to pause briefly on what happened to the knowledge itself, the accumulated skill and understanding that made all of this possible, because none of it lived in any single written manual that a new cook might simply pick up and study. A head cook nearing the end of her long service in the royal kitchens spent her final years according to the general pattern that shaped households like this one, passing along what she knew directly to those who would eventually take her place, not through formal instruction so much as through the simple, patient method of working alongside someone younger, day after day, until certain habits and certain instincts had transferred almost invisibly from one set of hands to another. How much spice a particular dish truly needed beyond what any written recipe could fully capture. Exactly how long pastry needed to rest before it behaved properly under a rolling pin. The particular texture of dough that men had proofed exactly long enough. This kind of knowledge embodied rather than written, moved through this world the way a river moves through a landscape, carving its path slowly, invisibly across years and even generations, carried entirely in the accumulated experience of people whose names, as we have said so many times tonight, rarely survived in any lasting record. And yet the knowledge itself survived, passed hand to hand, kitchen to kitchen, cook to apprentice, across the entire span of Elizabeth's long reign, and well beyond it, shaping English cooking and English hospitality in ways that would in their own quiet fashion outlast even the Queen these particular hands had once served so faithfully. I find something genuinely comforting in that thought, honestly, as we finally approach the close of tonight's long journey together. Nothing we have explored tonight has truly vanished, not entirely. The particular skill of shaping a Manet loaf, of coaxing real flavor from a modest winter pantry, of reading a return dish for what it reveals about someone's mood or appetite, all of it lived on quietly, carried forward by people who learned it the same patient way their own teachers once had, an unbroken thread of care and craft stretching back through centuries, connecting in its own small way all the way forward to tonight, to this quiet room, to you listening in the dark, carried gently towards sleep by a story built from all that accumulated patient human care. One last small memory before we finally let the candles burn down completely tonight. because I think it belongs here at the very end more than almost anywhere else in this long story. Imagine an evening unremarkable in every outward way, much like so many we have visited together tonight. Elizabeth sits at her private table, her lady standing nearby, the fire burning low and steady against the cooling summer air outside. The meal has been simple tonight. Bread, a little fish, since the day happens to fall during one of the many fasting periods we discussed earlier, and at the end, that same familiar dish of stewed pears has appeared in one form or another throughout nearly this entire story. She eats slowly tonight, unhurried, and her lady, watching quietly, as she has for so many years now, notices something she could not quite name if pressed to explain it. Some particular quality of stillness in the room. The kind of stillness that only settles over a house once every fire has been checked and every door has been quietly secured for the night. The kind that settles over a person who has for just this one small stretch of the evening genuinely set down every burden the rest of her day demanded she carry. No ambassador watching tonight, no careful diplomatic calculation folded into every gesture. Simply a woman tired in a particular way that comes from a lifetime of extraordinary responsibility, finding a small genuine comfort in warm bread and sweet fruit and the quiet, steady presence of people who have cared for her faithfully across so many years. This is where I want to leave you tonight. In this small, quiet room, candlelight flickering gently against fine white linen, the last traces of cinnamon and sugar lingering faintly in the warm air. The whole enormous patient world we have walked through together finally gently letting itself rest. Everything we have explored together. The kitchens and the cellars, the gardens and the markets, the tasters and confectioners, and the countless careful hands that made this single ordinary evening possible. All of it settles now into this one small peaceful moment, exactly as it was always meant to. The fire burns lower still. The lady finally allows herself to relax just slightly, sensing that tonight at least has been a gentle one, and Elizabeth, Queen of England, sits quietly in the candle light, finishing the last of her stewed pears entirely, completely for just these few remaining minutes, simply herself, and perhaps somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of your own life, you already carry pieces of the same inheritance without ever quite realizing it. A particular way you fold dough, because someone once showed you patiently exactly how. A particular dish you make for the people you love, not because a recipe demands it, but because you have simply always made it this way. Learn from watching, absorb slowly over years, the same way that young apprentice once learned from her own master cook. Care passed hand to hand, quietly across generations, rarely written down, never quite lost. Let that image stay with you now as your own evening finally settles toward its close. The warm bread, the sweet fruit, the quiet room, the people who care enough to get every small thing right night after night for years on end, without ever needing to be thanked for it. Let your own body settle the same way hers finally did. Shoulders soft, breathing slow, every small burden of your own long day gently set down for now. You do not have anywhere else to be tonight. You do not need to do anything else at all. Just rest here in this quiet candle-lit room exactly as long as you need to. Somewhere behind us now back through the whole long night we have spent together. That small private table still sits quietly in its own soft candlelight, the last of the fire settling into embers, the last of the wine resting untouched in its silver cup before you have even opened your eyes. The ovens in that world will already be lit again, patient and steady, exactly as they've been every single morning for years, exactly as they will continue to be for years still to come, long after tonight's story has faded quietly into whatever dreams find you. The bread will rise, the spice room will open, the gardener will kneel again among herbs, and somewhere quietly a taster will lift a small spoonful to his mouth and wait. The same careful, invisible ritual of trust and care beginning all over again. Elsewhere in that world tonight, a young apprentice sleeps too, her arms aching pleasantly from a long, honest day of work, dreaming perhaps of nothing more dramatic than tomorrow's bread, or the particular way sunlight will fall across the herb garden when she rises before dawn to gather what the kitchen needs. And somewhere a queen sleeps as well, watched over quietly, cared for completely, carrying whatever weight tomorrow will ask her, but resting for now simply as a woman resting. Nothing more complicated than that, her breathing slow and even in the dark, exactly as yours is beginning to grow now, too. You do not need to carry any of that forward with you. You do not need to hold on to a single fact or a single name from everything we walked through tonight. Just let it settle over you the way a warm blanket settles over tired shoulders, soft, unhurried, asking nothing of you at all. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts grow quieter, gentler, further apart. The way a fire grows quieter as it settles down toward its own last embers. Let the whole long, patient story we walked through together tonight simply rest now alongside you in the dark, needing nothing further from you at all. No attention, no effort, no more listening than you have already so generously given it. There is no rush now, no procession of dishes waiting to be carried, no ambassador watching for the smallest gesture, no ledger to balance before morning, no guarded corridor left to walk. Only quiet, only rest, only the slow, steady dark, settling around you exactly the way it settled so many nights ago and so many nights still come, around a small candle-lit room, a modest fire, and a woman finally briefly entirely at peace. Sleep well, friend. I will be here again next time, whenever you are ready to.